There is a small island in the western Pacific, roughly 500 kilometers south of the Mariana Islands northern chain, where the ocean runs so blue it looks almost invented, where the jungle presses right down to the shoreline and the trade winds move through the palms with a sound like quiet breathing, where, if you walk the right stretch of coastline at the right hour, the water is warm enough to feel like it was waiting for you. It is easy, standing on that shore today, to believe that nothing terrible ever happened here. But the ground remembers, the coral remembers, the caves cut into the limestone ridges of the Central Highlands still hold their silence the way old wounds hold their shape, long after the skin has healed over, long after the world has moved on. Beneath the surface of a place that looks, to any passing traveler, like paradise, there is a history so compressed and so violent that it is almost impossible to hold in a single thought. A history of people losing everything overnight, of soldiers on both sides discovering what human endurance actually means when the jungle closes in and the ammunition runs low and there is nowhere left to go. Of an island that became, for a few weeks in the summer of 1944, one of the most contested pieces of ground on the face of the earth. This is the story of Guam. Not just the battle, though the battle is extraordinary enough on its own terms. This is the story of everything that built toward those 3 weeks. The occupation that came before, the years of preparation that followed America's first catastrophic failure to hold the island, and the vast machine of men and ships and ordnance that was assembled, quietly and almost invisibly, while the rest of the world was watching Normandy. It is the story of what happens when two military forces, both convinced that the ground beneath them cannot be surrendered, meet in a space that has no room for retreat. And it is, underneath all of that, the story of a people, the Chamorro, who had no vote in any of it, and who paid a price that neither side ever fully reckoned with. If you are here for the first time, welcome. Get comfortable. This is a long one, and it is meant to be. This documentary covers the entire history of the Battle of Guam, from its deepest roots to its final, costly accounting, told in full, without shortcuts, the way a story this serious deserves to be told. If you have been here before, you already know what to expect. Slow, careful narration, built for the quiet hours, for the kind of attention that only comes when the rest of the world has gone still. Settle in. Dim the lights if you haven't already. We are going to be here a while, and there is nowhere else you need to be. Before we get into the mechanics of invasion plans and amphibious doctrine and the particular geography of beaches that would be named and renamed and argued over for decades afterward, take a moment with the scale of what we are discussing. In the summer of 1944, the United States was fighting a global war on two separate fronts, separated by an ocean. It was sustaining armies in Western Europe, in Italy, in the islands of the Central Pacific, and the jungles of New Guinea. It was supplying allies on 3 continents. Its industrial economy was running at a rate of production that no nation had ever achieved before, and still the demand for ships, for aircraft, for artillery rounds, for field rations and surgical equipment and landing craft exceeded what the system could comfortably provide. And yet, in the middle of all of that, American planners looked at a small island that Japan had captured in 48 hours and said, "We are going to take it back." Not because it was easy, not because the cost would be low, but because Guam was American territory and leaving it in Japanese hands was something that the United States had decided, at the highest levels of government and strategy, it was not prepared to do. That decision, simple in its statement, enormous in its implications, is where this story really begins. It begins, if we are being precise about it, on the 7th of December, 1941, when the world that Guam had known for 4 decades ended in a single morning. But it also begins much earlier than that, in the centuries of Chamorro civilization that shaped the island before any colonial power arrived. And it extends much further forward than August of 1944, into the decades of American military buildup that transformed Guam into something its pre-war residents would barely have recognized. History, when you follow it honestly, never starts where you expect and never ends where you think it should. What you will find in this documentary is every phase of that story, told in sequence, with as much care for the human dimension as for the operational one. The soldiers who landed on the beaches of Asan, the Japanese garrison that had spent months digging into the Fonte Plateau, knowing, on some level, that the ships would come, the Chamorro civilians caught between 2 armies, losing homes and relatives and the texture of daily life to a war that was not their war. The commanders on both sides making decisions under conditions of incomplete information, physical exhaustion, and enormous pressure, some of those decisions working out, others compounding the misery of the men below them. We will not rush through any of it. That is not what this channel does, and it is not what these stories deserve. The Battle of Guam lasted roughly 3 weeks in its conventional phase, but the island was not truly at peace for years afterward, and the men who fought there carried what happened to them for the rest of their lives. The least we can do is give it the time it requires. So if you are new here and you have found this video through some late-night chain of recommendations, welcome to the channel. What we do here is cover the great conflicts of the 20th century with the depth and pacing that long-form audiences deserve. If this is the kind of storytelling you have been looking for, subscribe. There is a great deal more where this came from, and we add to it regularly. If you are already part of this community and you have been waiting for this particular story, thank you for your patience. It has been worth taking the time to get it right. Now, close your eyes if you want to, or let them rest on something soft and distant. The voice will carry you through everything that follows. We have many hours ahead of us, and we will spend them in the Western Pacific, in the heat and the rain and the coral-dusted dark, in the company of people who lived through one of the most dramatic chapters of the Second World War. The island is quiet now. The palms are moving in the wind. The ocean is doing what it always does, pressing against the shore, pulling back, pressing again, patient and indifferent and older than everything. Let's begin. There is an island in the Western Pacific that most Americans in 1941 could not have found on a map. Sitting roughly 5,500 kilometers west of Hawaii and just 13 degrees north of the equator, Guam was the southernmost and largest of the Mariana Islands, a thin crescent of volcanic rock and coral, roughly 50 kilometers long and between 6 and 13 kilometers wide, draped in tropical jungle and ringed by reefs that turned the surrounding sea an extraordinary shade of blue-green. It was warm there, almost always. The trade winds moved through the casuarina trees, and the villages along the coast had the unhurried quality of places that history seemed to have agreed to leave alone. For most of its inhabitants, both the indigenous Chamorro people and the small American military contingent stationed there, life in 1941 followed a rhythm that felt permanent, even timeless. They could not have known that within months, everything about that rhythm would be destroyed. Guam had been American territory since the end of the Spanish-American War, when Spain ceded the island in 1898. For more than 4 decades after that, it was administered by the United States Navy, a fact that tells you something important about how Washington viewed the place. It was not conceived as a community to be developed, or a population to be fully incorporated into the American political system. The Chamorro people living there, who numbered somewhere around 20,000 by the early 1940s, had no path to full American citizenship, despite their island flying the American flag. They were subjects of a naval administration that built what it needed and left the rest largely as it was. A Navy radio station, a small fuel depot, a modest medical facility. These were the features of an American presence more interested in the island's position on a map than in the welfare of the people living on it. What Washington had conspicuously failed to build on Guam was anything resembling a serious military defense. The island lay deep inside what strategists had long designated as the Western Pacific, territory that, in the event of a war with Japan, American war planners had already conceded might be indefensible. The plan known as War Plan Orange, which had guided American strategic thinking about a potential Pacific conflict for decades, essentially wrote Guam off. It sat too far from Pearl Harbor, too close to Japan's island territories in the Carolines and the Marshalls, to be reinforced quickly enough if the situation deteriorated. American planners knew this. They discussed it, documented it, and ultimately did very little about it, bound by budget constraints and the lingering hope that diplomacy might still prevent catastrophe. The result was a garrison that, by any honest military assessment, was inadequate for its purpose. Fewer than 400 regular United States Navy and Marine Corps personnel held the island alongside a small local defense force of Chamorro soldiers. The equipment available to them was aging, in some cases genuinely obsolete. Weapons and vehicles that belonged to an earlier era of warfare. There were no modern fighter aircraft based on Guam, no coastal artillery batteries of meaningful caliber, no tanks, no serious anti-aircraft coverage. The Marines who served there were professional, determined, and well-trained for the era, but they were also vastly outnumbered before a single shot had been fired. If anyone in Washington had looked clearly at the situation and been asked to describe what would happen if Japan chose to strike, they would have known the answer. Guam would fall. Outside the military installations, the island retained a quality that the word peaceful does not quite do justice to. The Chamorro people had built their lives across centuries of extraordinary resilience, having already survived Spanish colonialism, epidemic disease, and the long disruption of American naval administration. They fished, farmed, maintained extended family networks, and preserved elements of their language and culture through persistence rather than official encouragement. The village of Hagatnya, which Americans called Agana, served as the island's administrative and commercial center. A modest grid of streets lined with low buildings where the rhythms of daily life included the morning market, the Catholic church on Sundays, and the comfortable familiarity of a small community where most people knew one another. Whatever anxieties existed about the war consuming Europe and the tensions rising in Asia, daily life on Guam had not yet been reorganized around them. On the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor changed the world in approximately 90 minutes. The news reached Guam quickly, though communications were imperfect, and the full scope of what had happened took time to assemble. The garrison's commanders understood almost immediately that their situation had become desperate. They were cut off. The nearest American forces of consequence were nearly 5,500 kilometers to the east, and the nearest Japanese air bases were a matter of a few hundred kilometers away. The Japanese knew Guam's weakness as well as the Americans did, and they moved with the speed that knowledge permits. Within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese aircraft based in the neighboring Marianas flew over Guam. The bombing began almost immediately after the garrison received word of the wider assault, striking the Pan American Hotel used as a civilian facility, the Marine Barracks, and the Pitti Navy Yard, among other targets. The strikes were not enormous by the standards that would come to define the Pacific Air War, but against a garrison with virtually no air defense, they were lethal enough. The Pan American flying boat clipper that had been anchored in the harbor was among the early casualties, a detail that captures something essential about the moment. Even the route of escape was eliminated within the first hours. For 4 days, the garrison held. It held not because anyone believed the island could ultimately be saved, but because soldiers and Marines do not put down their weapons simply because the arithmetic of their situation is unfavorable. The commander of the Marine forces, understanding there was no reinforcement coming, organized what defense he could with the men and equipment available. Japanese air attacks continued. A naval blockade tightened around the island. The defenders waited for what they already knew was coming, enduring what they could not prevent, and fighting with the discipline of professionals who understood the difference between surrendering without cause and fighting until the cause was exhausted. On the 10th of December, Japanese ground forces came ashore. The landings were methodical and overwhelming in their scale relative to the defenders. Several thousand Japanese troops came from the direction of Dunkar's beach in the pre-dawn hours, moving inland against defenders who were outgunned in every dimension of the engagement. The fighting that followed in the dark and in the early morning light was genuine. The garrison's personnel did not wave a white flag at the first sight of the enemy. They fought back in the streets, in the Navy Yard, across the terrain they knew, and the Japanese did not. Marines and sailors died in that resistance, taking some of the attackers with them. It was hopeless, and it was real, and both of those things were true at the same time. By mid-morning of the 10th of December, it was over. The commanding officer, recognizing that further resistance would produce only further deaths without any prospect of changing the outcome, ordered surrender. Guam passed from American into Japanese hands, the first American territory to fall to a foreign enemy since the War of 1812. The shock in Washington was genuine, even if the strategists knew in the abstract that Guam was always going to be exposed. Abstract knowledge and lived reality are different things, and seeing a piece of American-administered territory erased from the map of American holdings in a matter of days carried a weight that the war plans had never fully captured. For the Chamorro people watching this transition, the calculus was different and more intimate. These were their homes, their villages, their families. They had lived under American administration without full democratic rights, and now they were passing under Japanese military authority, which would prove far harsher in ways that the coming weeks and months would make brutally clear. The American soldiers and sailors taken prisoner would eventually be transported to camps across Japan's Pacific holdings and the Japanese home islands themselves, where they would spend years as captives. What remained on Guam after the 10th of December 1941 was a Japanese military occupation and a Chamorro population bracing for whatever came next. In Washington, Guam's fall registered as one piece of a catastrophe that stretched from Hawaii to the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, a cascading series of losses that reshaped the Pacific overnight. But it registered as something more specific than just another strategic setback. It was American soil. Americans had been captured there. Americans had died there. And the flag that had flown over the island's installations now did not fly there at all. For a nation that was still absorbing the scale of what had just happened to it, that specificity mattered. Guam became not merely a military objective for a future campaign, but a symbol, the kind of symbol that sustains purpose through the long, grinding months of rebuilding and counterattack that a nation fighting a war of reversal requires to keep its resolve intact. The island would not be forgotten. It could not be, and in the nature of that impossibility lay the first seeds of everything that would follow 3 years later, when the ships came back. When the last shots faded over Guam in December of 1941, a silence settled across the island that felt nothing like peace. The American flag came down. Japanese soldiers moved through the streets of Agana with the quiet confidence of men who believed they had claimed something permanent. For the Chamorro people, the island's indigenous population, whose ancestors had lived on this volcanic rock in the western Pacific for thousands of years, the days that followed would test every instinct of survival they possessed. They had watched the fighting from their homes and their fields, had heard the shells fall and the aircraft scream overhead, and now they watched strangers in unfamiliar uniforms take possession of everything they had ever known. The occupation of Guam had begun, and it would last for more than 900 days. The Japanese military administration moved swiftly to establish control. Within weeks of the surrender, Japanese commanders imposed a rigid governing structure over the civilian population, requiring Chamorros to bow to Japanese soldiers in the street, to learn Japanese customs and greetings, and to adopt new names assigned by the occupying authority. Schools that had once taught English under American administration were now restructured to teach Japanese language and imperial ideology. The intent was unmistakable, not merely to occupy the island militarily, but to remake it culturally, to erase the American influence that had shaped Guam for more than 4 decades and replace it with the values of the Japanese Empire. For a population that had lived under American governance since the conclusion of the Spanish-American War, and had, by many accounts, genuinely embraced the relationship, this dismantling of familiar life struck with particular force. Forced labor became the defining hardship of the occupation years. Japanese military engineers required large construction projects across the island: roads, airfields, fortifications, supply depots, and they required bodies to build them. Chamorro men, and in many cases women and older teenagers, were conscripted into labor gangs that worked long hours under military supervision, clearing jungle, hauling materials, and excavating the earth for the defensive network the Japanese intended to make permanent. Payment, when it came at all, was irregular and often meaningless against the backdrop of a wartime economy the occupiers controlled entirely. Food grown by Chamorro farmers was frequently confiscated for military use, reducing civilian communities to subsistence conditions as the occupation stretched from months into years. Disease spread through populations whose access to medicine had been cut off, and the ordinary texture of daily life, the rhythms of farming, fishing, and family, frayed under the constant pressure of military rule. The Japanese command did not treat Guam's strategic position casually. Sitting in the central arc of the Mariana Islands, roughly 2,500 kilometers from Tokyo, and commanding key approaches across the central Pacific, the island was understood to be a potential target for American counterattack. Japanese engineers and military planners invested heavily in defensive infrastructure, constructing a network of coastal artillery positions, anti-aircraft batteries, blockhouses, bunkers, and reinforced caves that were designed to make any amphibious assault as costly as possible. Beaches likely to serve as landing zones were studded with obstacles: wooden stakes, wire, and in some sectors, mined approaches intended to channel attacking forces into pre-registered fields of fire. The Japanese were not blind to the possibility that the Americans would return. They intended to make that return catastrophic. Airfields were a central priority. The Japanese expanded existing aviation facilities and constructed new ones, understanding that control of the air over the Marianas would be essential to any defense of the Western Pacific. The airfields on Guam became active nodes in the Japanese military's regional air network, supporting patrols and strikes across vast stretches of ocean. Garrison forces arrived in successive waves, and by the time American planners were seriously considering a return to the island in early 1944, the Japanese military presence on Guam had grown substantially beyond what it had been in the immediate aftermath of the conquest. Guam was no longer a lightly held outpost. It was being shaped into a fortress. The Chamorro population navigated this world with extraordinary difficulty and, in many instances, extraordinary courage. Collaboration with the occupiers was, for many, a matter of survival rather than sympathy. The alternative to compliance could be punishment, imprisonment, or worse. Japanese military authorities maintained their control through a combination of inducement and threat, and the threat was never entirely absent. There were incidents of brutality, executions, and organized violence against civilians, particularly as the occupation wore on and the broader tide of the Pacific War began to shift against Japan. Rumors and fragments of news filtered through the island, smuggled information, whispered accounts from those who had contact with the outside world, and among many Chamorros, a quiet hope for American return burned steadily throughout the darkest years. American prisoners of war captured during the fall of Guam in 1941 had been removed from the island and transported to camps in Japan and elsewhere across the empire's holdings, severing one of the last visible connections to the pre-occupation world. The absence of the American military personnel who had been part of Guam's garrison for years was felt within the civilian community as another kind of loss. What remained was an island community reduced to its most fundamental resources, its land, its family networks, and its ability to endure. Chamorros drew on all of these through the years of occupation, and their survival under conditions of sustained hardship would later become a central part of how the island remembered the war. As 1943 gave way to 1944, changes in the broader Pacific conflict began to ripple toward Guam even before the first American ship appeared on the horizon. The Japanese military's position across the Central Pacific was deteriorating. Island chains that had seemed firmly within imperial control were coming under pressure from American forces moving steadily westward. Naval engagements had gone badly for Japan in several theaters, and the flow of supplies and reinforcements to the Marianas, already strained, became increasingly difficult to maintain against American submarines operating aggressively in the surrounding waters. The garrison on Guam received reinforcements and additional equipment, but the full weight of material and personnel the defensive plan required was never assembled. Gaps remained in the defensive network, and the soldiers who manned the fortifications they had built knew, on some level, that the imperial promise of relief and resupply was becoming difficult to keep. General Takeshi Takashina, commanding Japanese forces on the island, understood his situation with clarity. He was not operating under the illusion that Guam could be held indefinitely against a determined American assault, backed by the industrial output of the United States. What he could do, what military doctrine and the culture of the Japanese imperial military demanded he do, was make the cost of recapture as high as possible. He continued to direct construction of defensive positions, particularly in the island's elevated central terrain, where the steep ridgelines and dense jungle vegetation offered natural advantages to a defending force. The highlands were being prepared as a killing ground. If the beaches could not stop the Americans, the mountains would slow them. Every meter of ground would be contested. This was not defeatism. It was a calculated military strategy built on the belief that American casualties and American will might eventually be broken. The Chamorro population, meanwhile, lived in the knowledge that the war swirling through the Pacific was drawing closer. In the final months of the occupation, Japanese military activity on the island intensified visibly. More troops arrived. Construction accelerated. The behavior of the occupying forces shifted in ways that suggested the military authorities were preparing for something, a defensive effort of a scale the island had not previously seen. For ordinary civilians, this intensification made daily life more precarious, not less. Resources were diverted more aggressively toward military purposes, and the relationship between the garrison and the population it governed grew more tense. The promise of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, the ideological framework the Japanese military offered as justification for empire, rang increasingly hollow against the lived experience of enforced labor and confiscated harvests. By the middle of 1944, Guam stood at a threshold. The Japanese had spent more than 2 years transforming it from a lightly defended American outpost into a fortified position of genuine military complexity. The bunkers and coastal guns and cave networks and reinforced highland positions represented an enormous investment of labor, much of it extracted from the people the occupiers claimed to be liberating. The garrison was not large enough, not well enough supplied, and not well enough connected to the naval and air power that might have made the island truly impregnable. But it was prepared to fight. It was prepared to make the Americans pay a heavy price for every field and every ridgeline and every stretch of beach. What the Japanese command could not account for was the scale of what was coming, the weight of American industrial production, the experience of American commanders who had been learning the brutal mathematics of Pacific amphibious warfare for nearly 3 years, and the deep, driving need of a nation to take back soil it considered its own. The island waited. The ocean stretched empty to the east, not for much longer. 2 years had passed since the flags came down on Guam, 2 years since the garrison had been overwhelmed, since the Chamorro people had watched foreign soldiers raise a different banner above the island they called home. In Washington, in the shipyards of the American mainland, in the vast industrial complexes humming day and night across a continent mobilized for total war, those 2 years had not been idle. They had been furious. They had been transformative. And by the opening months of 1944, the nation that had stumbled into the Pacific War on the back foot was unrecognizable compared to what it had been on that December morning when everything changed. The rebuilding had been staggering in its scale and relentless in its pace, and the United States was no longer reacting to Japan's moves across the Pacific. It was dictating them. The story of how America recovered from the shock of Pearl Harbor is not simply a story of ships and planes and trained battalions, though all of those things matter enormously. It is a story of national will hardening under pressure, of an entire society reorganizing itself around a single collective purpose. Factories that had built automobiles began building tanks. Women who had never touched a rivet gun became the backbone of industrial production. The American economy, the largest the world had ever seen, turned its full weight toward the production of war materiel at a rate that no other nation on Earth could match. By 1944, American shipyards were completing warships at intervals that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. Aircraft were rolling off assembly lines by the thousands. The logistical machinery of a continental power was grinding into full gear, and its output was beginning to register in every theater of the war. In the Pacific specifically, the reversal of fortune had been dramatic. The naval catastrophe at Pearl Harbor had crippled but not destroyed American sea power, and the battles at Coral Sea and Midway in 1942 had demonstrated something important, that Japan's advantage was not permanent. At Midway, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 4 fleet carriers in a single engagement, a blow from which it would never fully recover. Japan's ability to project offensive naval power across the Central Pacific began to erode from that moment onward, while America's capacity to project its own power was growing month by month. By 1944, the balance had shifted decisively. The new fast carriers of the Essex class were operational, screened by fast battleships and cruisers capable of sustaining operations across enormous distances. The Pacific Fleet had become something qualitatively different from the force that had limped away from Pearl Harbor. Larger, faster, better supplied, and commanded by officers who had learned their trade under fire. The strategic debate about how to use this power had been fierce. American commanders had argued seriously among themselves about the best path toward Japan, and those arguments had real consequences for the men who would ultimately do the fighting. One school of thought, championed by General Douglas MacArthur, favored a drive through New Guinea and the Philippines, using the island chains of the southwestern Pacific as stepping stones toward the Japanese home islands. Another school, associated with Admiral Chester Nimitz and the naval command in Pearl Harbor, favored a more direct thrust through the Central Pacific, capturing key islands that could serve as air and naval bases while bypassing heavily fortified Japanese strongholds that were not worth the blood they would cost to take. The argument was not merely strategic, it was personal, institutional, and deeply political. In the end, Washington decided to pursue both approaches simultaneously, but it was the Central Pacific Drive, the island-hopping campaign across open ocean toward Japan, that would determine the fate of Guam. The logic of island hopping was elegant in its brutality. Japan had seized an enormous arc of territory stretching across thousands of kilometers of ocean, and defending every island in that arc was simply impossible. American planners recognized that by striking selectively, choosing which islands to take and which to bypass and isolate, they could advance rapidly while leaving entire Japanese garrison forces to wither without resupply. An island bypassed was not an island defeated in the traditional sense, but it was an island neutralized. The Japanese soldiers left behind on bypassed islands would wait for a relief that never came, their fortifications and their courage rendered irrelevant by geography and American naval supremacy. It was a cold calculation, but it worked. The advance through the Central Pacific moved faster than anyone had seriously anticipated when the strategy was first being debated. The Mariana Islands, a chain of volcanic islands running roughly north to south in the western Pacific, sat at the center of this calculation. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were the 3 largest islands in the southern Marianas, and together they represented something of extraordinary value. From airfields on those islands, the new B-29 Superfortress bombers, the longest-range heavy bombers the world had yet seen, could reach the Japanese home islands themselves. For the first time, American planners would have bases close enough to bring the war directly to the Japanese population and industrial centers. The Marianas were not simply another link in the chain of Pacific islands. They were a key that could unlock the entire strategic situation. Taking them would bring the war to Japan's doorstep in a way that nothing else in the Central Pacific Drive had yet accomplished. Within the Marianas, Guam occupied a position that was simultaneously strategic and symbolic. Strategically, it was the largest island in the chain, with the potential for major airfields and a deep harbor capable of supporting fleet operations. It sat at a natural crossroads between the central and southwestern Pacific, making it valuable as both a base for offensive operations toward the Philippines and as a logistics hub for the growing American presence in the region. Its position would allow American forces to threaten Japanese supply lines and to project power in multiple directions simultaneously. Any serious campaign against Japan that came later in the war would need Guam, and American planners knew it. The island was not a trophy to be won for its own sake. It was a piece of essential military infrastructure that the United States needed to function. But the symbolism could not be separated from the strategy, and in the early months of 1944, as plans for the Mariana campaign were being finalized, the symbolic dimension pressed on the minds of American commanders and political leaders with a weight that went beyond pure calculation. Guam was American territory. It had been American territory since the end of the 19th century. The men who had defended it in December of 1941 had been American servicemen wearing American uniforms, and the civilian population living under Japanese occupation had been American nationals. Allowing that territory to remain in enemy hands was an affront that the United States government had never accepted, even when the military situation made recovery impossible. Reclaiming Guam was not simply a military operation. It was, in a deeper sense, a statement about what America was and what it was willing to do to fulfill its obligations to the people and places under its flag. That symbolic weight shaped the planning in ways both subtle and direct. The operation to retake Guam was designated higher priority than pure strategic calculus alone might have required. Resources were allocated to it with a generosity that reflected its political importance alongside its military value, and the framing of the campaign in communications to the American public and to American troops consistently emphasized the reclamation of American soil, the fulfillment of a promise to a people who had waited and endured. For servicemen who would wade ashore under fire in the months ahead, this framing was not merely propaganda. Many of them believed it, and belief is its own kind of combat power. Planning for the Marianas campaign, which would encompass operations against Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in sequence, moved forward through the spring of 1944 with the detailed precision that large-scale amphibious operations demanded. The lessons of earlier Pacific landings, at Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, at Kwajalein, had been absorbed painfully and applied methodically. Tarawa, in particular, had been a brutal teacher. The assault on that small atoll had cost American forces nearly 1,000 killed in fewer than 80 hours, a shock that forced commanders to rethink everything from preliminary bombardment doctrine to the design of landing craft. By the time planning for Guam reached its final stages, American amphibious doctrine had matured considerably. Pre-landing bombardment would be heavier, longer, and more precisely targeted. Naval gunfire support would be coordinated more carefully with infantry advances. Medical evacuation procedures had been revised. Nothing had been left to chance that could be controlled. The men who would carry out the assault on Guam were already training across bases in Hawaii and the Pacific, rehearsing landings, practicing fire coordination, learning the specific terrain features they would encounter from aerial photographs and intelligence reports gathered by submarines that had prowled close to the island's shores. They were professional soldiers and marines, many of whom had already seen combat and understood what the coming weeks would ask of them. The Pacific War had a particular character: intense, close, fought in heat and humidity across terrain that seemed almost hostile to human presence, and the veterans among them carried that knowledge quietly. 1944 had brought America to a position of growing strength, but strength did not mean easy. The island ahead was fortified, defended, and bitterly contested before the first shot had been fired. What America had built in 2 years of furious preparation was the capacity to win. What it had not yet found was a way to win cheaply. While the world's attention fixed itself on the beaches of Normandy in the early days of June 1944, another vast military undertaking was quietly gathering momentum on the other side of the earth. Newspaper front pages carried photographs of Allied soldiers wading through French surf. Radio broadcasts crackled with dispatches from the hedgerows of Normandy. Politicians and generals spoke of liberation in terms that pointed almost exclusively westward, toward Berlin and the collapsing architecture of the Third Reich. And yet, in the coral blue waters of the Central Pacific, something enormous was being assembled. Not with fanfare, not with the attention of the world's press corps, but with the methodical, almost silent precision of a nation that had learned, through bitter experience, how to wage war on two oceans at once. The build-up for Guam was happening in plain sight and being missed entirely, swallowed by the magnitude of what was unfolding in Europe. The strategic logic behind Guam's recapture had been hardening inside American planning rooms for months. Senior commanders understood that the island-hopping strategy required more than just forward momentum. It required anchors, fixed points from which further operations could radiate westward toward the Philippines and ultimately toward the Japanese home islands themselves. Guam was not simply a target of opportunity. It was a specific piece of American territory, seized in the chaotic days following Pearl Harbor, when the island's tiny garrison had stood almost entirely alone against an overwhelming Japanese assault. Reclaiming it carried a weight that transcended pure military calculation. It was a statement of intent, a promise delivered to the men who had been captured there and to every American who understood what it meant when your own soil fell beneath an enemy flag. The planners who bent over their maps in the spring of 1944 were not merely plotting an amphibious operation, they were engineering a return. The scale of what that return demanded was almost beyond comprehension for those not immersed in the machinery of it. Feeding, arming, transporting, and landing roughly 55,000 troops on a defended Pacific island required a supply chain of extraordinary complexity, stretching back across thousands of kilometers of open ocean to depots, shipyards, and assembly points scattered across the Hawaiian Islands, the American West Coast, and the newly captured atolls of the Marshalls. Every rifle, every artillery shell, every case of rations, every medical kit, every roll of communications wire had to be accounted for, loaded, documented, and sequenced so that the right material arrived at the right beach at the right moment. Logistics officers worked through nights and weekends in the weeks preceding the operation, cross-referencing manifests and calculating cargo tonnage against ship capacity, with the knowledge that a mistake made in a warehouse in Pearl Harbor could cost lives on a beach 3,000 kilometers away. The ships themselves formed a catalogue of American industrial power that would have seemed fantastical just 3 years earlier. Battleships, their main guns capable of hurling rounds the weight of a small automobile across distances measured in tens of kilometers, were assigned to the preliminary bombardment force. Heavy and light cruisers formed an outer ring of fire support, their rapid-firing secondary armaments able to saturate a target area in seconds. Destroyers wove between the larger vessels, screening against submarine threats that remained a genuine concern even as American anti-submarine operations had dramatically thinned Japanese undersea capability in this part of the ocean. Transport vessels, large, unglamorous, and absolutely essential, carried the bulk of the assault troops in conditions that were crowded, hot, and deeply uncomfortable for the weeks of transit that preceded the operation. Aircraft carriers provided the aerial umbrella under which the entire enterprise would operate. their flight decks launching missions that would soften the island's defenses even before the first naval gun fired. The men being loaded onto those transports had been drawn from formations with very different histories. Some units had already seen bitter combat in earlier Pacific operations, carrying the institutional memory of hard lessons learned on other islands, lessons about Japanese defensive tactics, about the suffocating density of tropical jungle, about the way defenders could disappear into terrain and make every 100 meters of advance cost more than the 100 before it. Other formations were newer, trained and equipped and eager in the way that soldiers are before they have been tested, carrying an energy that veterans sometimes envied and sometimes pitied in roughly equal measure. Together, they formed an assault force whose aggregate experience, firepower, and numerical strength dwarfed anything the island's Japanese garrison could hope to match, though everyone with knowledge of previous Pacific landings understood that numbers on paper rarely told the complete story of what waited in the hills. Command arrangements for the operation reflected the layered authority structure that American Pacific strategy had built over more than 2 years of hard-won organizational learning. Naval commanders held responsibility for delivering the force to the beach and for providing the fire support that would shape conditions for the assault. Marine and Army commanders held responsibility for what happened once boots touched sand, for the inland drives, for the reduction of fortified positions, for the grinding daily work of pushing a determined enemy off terrain he had spent months preparing. The coordination required between these different service arms, the careful timing of naval fire, the sequencing of airstrikes, the choreography of landing craft hitting beaches in the correct order, demanded rehearsal, and rehearsal was exactly what the assault forces conducted in the weeks before the operation sailed. Practice landings, fire support coordination exercises, communications drills, all of it repeated until the movements became almost automatic, because automatic was what you needed when the beach was real and the enemy was not a training target. The operation did not proceed entirely on the original timetable that planners had laid out. Events elsewhere in the Pacific created a delay that pushed the Guam landing back from its initial projected date, stretching the preliminary naval bombardment period and requiring adjustments to logistics schedules that had already been calculated to fine tolerances. For the troops aboard the transports, this delay meant additional days and then weeks at sea in equatorial heat, in cramped berthing spaces, waiting for an operation that could not begin until conditions elsewhere allowed it. Morale required careful management. Officers organized training exercises aboard ship, weapons maintenance drills, physical conditioning, briefings on the terrain and enemy positions that updated men on what intelligence had gleaned about Japanese dispositions. The waiting was its own particular form of ordeal, separate from, but connected to the combat that followed it. Submarine operations formed an often overlooked element of the build-up. American submarines had been working the waters around the Mariana Islands for months, gathering intelligence on Japanese shipping movements, disrupting resupply lines, and providing reconnaissance information that fed directly into the planning process. The submarines operated in conditions of extreme isolation, their crews aware that the margin between a successful patrol and catastrophe was measured in seconds and centimeters. Their contribution to the Guam operation was largely invisible to the men who would eventually land on the beaches, but the intelligence they gathered and the Japanese supply ships they sent to the bottom shaped the conditions that those men would face when they arrived. The Japanese garrison on Guam was not unaware that something was being prepared. Their commanders had followed American movements through what intelligence sources remained available to them and understood that the Mariana Islands occupied a place on the American line of advance that made their capture a near certainty. But understanding a threat in general terms and being able to respond to it specifically are separated by a gulf that was becoming increasingly unbridgeable for Japanese forces in the Central Pacific by mid-1944. Their resupply routes had been interdicted. Their air power had been dramatically reduced in a series of engagements that left them without the aerial cover that might have complicated an American approach. They were, in the blunt language of military analysis, being set up for a defeat they could not prevent, only delay and make costly. It was something closer to calibrated assurance, the confidence that comes not from certainty about outcomes, but from knowing that the preparation has been as thorough as circumstances allow. Every contingency that could be anticipated had been addressed. Every shortfall that had been identified in previous operations had been studied and, where possible, corrected. The fleet assembling for Guam was measurably better prepared, better equipped, better trained, better supplied than any comparable American amphibious force that had preceded it in the Pacific. That was the product of 3 years of war, of hard learning bought with lives, of a nation's industrial and organizational machinery finally reaching the full expression of its capacity. As the assault fleet completed its final preparations and the transport ships rode at anchor in waters still hundreds of kilometers from their objective, the men aboard them existed in that particular suspension of military time that precedes major operations, neither at peace nor yet at war, caught between the world they had come from and the one they were moving toward. Some wrote letters, some played cards and talked about what they would do when it was over. Some studied the briefing materials they had been given one more time, committing beach profiles and objective coordinates and unit boundaries to memory, with the quiet, serious attention of men who understood that knowledge might be the difference between walking off an island and not. The fleet moved. The ocean was vast and largely empty and utterly indifferent to what these ships carried and what they intended. Somewhere ahead, roughly 3,000 kilometers west of Pearl Harbor, an island waited, with its bunkers, its highlands, its hidden defenders, and the long echo of an earlier American defeat that had never entirely faded from the memory of those who had survived it. The guns opened before the island could see what was coming. In the pre-dawn hours of the 8th of June 1944, American cruisers and destroyers moved into position off the western coast of Guam and began their work with a deliberateness that bordered on the mechanical. There was no fanfare, no dramatic announcement broadcast across the water. The first shells simply arrived, tearing through the warm Pacific air and detonating against the island's western shoreline with a sound that rolled back across the fleet like distant thunder. Japanese sentries along the coastal emplacements would have heard it before they understood it, and then there would have been no time left for understanding at all. What had been a fortified island, carefully prepared, methodically reinforced over more than 2 years of occupation, was about to be taken apart piece by piece from the sea. For the men aboard those vessels, it was the beginning of a job. For the men on the island below those arcing trajectories, it was the beginning of something far more final. The scale of what American planners had authorized was unlike anything the island had previously endured. Naval gunfire support missions had been conducted across the Pacific before, but Guam presented a particular challenge. Its terrain was dense, its interior rugged, and Japanese engineers had spent months constructing defensive positions that were not merely dug into the earth, but woven into it. Gun emplacements had been carved into ridgelines and concealed beneath camouflage. Bunkers had been reinforced with timber and coral and built to survive near misses. The bombardment, therefore, could not be a single overwhelming wave and nothing more. It had to be sustained, systematic, and varied in its targeting, cycling through coastal installations, airfields, inland supply depots, suspected artillery positions, and communication nodes day after day until as much of the island's defensive architecture as possible had been reduced to rubble. The men planning the operation understood they were not simply destroying positions, they were buying time for the landing force, time measured in lives. From the 8th of June onward, the bombardment settled into a punishing rhythm. Battleships moved closer inshore during daylight hours, their largest guns speaking in slow, enormous cadences that shook the hulls of nearby vessels with each discharge. Cruisers worked steadily against intermediate targets, reinforced structures, road junctions, supply routes threading through the interior. Destroyers, drawing less water and therefore able to approach more closely, ranged up and down the coastline, suppressing individual gun positions and searching out targets of opportunity. Aviation added another layer to the assault, as carrier-based aircraft flew strike missions against targets the naval guns could not efficiently reach. Positions on reverse slopes, installations tucked behind ridgelines, and the airfields at Orote Peninsula that Japan's garrison needed intact for any prospect of aerial reinforcement. For the defenders on the ground, there was no clear direction from which the threat was not coming. The sky burned, the coastline churned, the earth itself seemed to be coming apart. For the Japanese garrison, the experience of living beneath that bombardment for nearly 2 weeks was its own kind of campaign. Prepared fighting positions that had taken weeks to construct could be reduced in moments. Supply caches that had been assembled over months, ammunition, food, medical stores, were struck and destroyed or rendered inaccessible beneath collapsed earth and burning vegetation. Communications infrastructure suffered heavily, severing the links between commanders and their subordinate units at precisely the moment coordination mattered most. Men who had been ordered to hold their positions found those positions were simply gone, not captured, not overrun, but erased. And the Japanese response to this was not to break, but to adapt, because there was nowhere to go and no order had been given to go anywhere. Units pulled back from the most exposed coastal positions and moved deeper into the island's interior, redistributing into caves and reinforced tunnels and terrain features that offered natural protection against the shells falling from the sea. This adaptation carried its own military logic. Japanese commanders understood, with a clarity born of 2 years of watching American capabilities grow across the Pacific, that they could not survive in the open against this kind of firepower. The doctrine that shaped their defense of Guam was not built around defeating the landings on the beach, not entirely, but around making the inland campaign so costly that American commanders would reconsider their timetables, that Washington would question whether the island was worth what it was taking. Every man who survived the bombardment by retreating into a cave or a fortified tunnel represented a potential casualty for the landing force. Every supply cache that survived in a concealed position represented continued resistance. The bombardment was destroying the infrastructure of Japanese defense, but it was also, paradoxically, pushing the remaining garrison into precisely the kind of dispersed, terrain-integrated posture that would make them hardest to find and destroy once American boots were on the ground. The Orote Peninsula received particular attention from American planners. Jutting into the sea on the island's western coast, it housed the primary Japanese airfield, a facility that, if left functional, could complicate the landings and provide a base for Japanese counter-air operations against the invasion fleet. Carrier aircraft struck the airfield repeatedly over the course of the bombardment, cratering runways, destroying aircraft on the ground, and dismantling fuel and ordnance storage. Naval gunfire added to the destruction, working systematically along the peninsula's edges and into the interior installations. By the final days before the scheduled landing, what had been a functioning military airfield had been reduced to a field of craters connected by strips of shattered concrete. The hangars collapsed, the support buildings burned out, the ground itself rearranged by the cumulative weight of ordnance that had fallen upon it. The Japanese would not be flying anything from Orote in the near term. That was precisely the point. American planners had also designated specific beach areas for the landings. The stretch near Asan on the northern approach and the beaches near Agat in the south. And the preliminary bombardment paid close, sustained attention to the defensive positions commanding those shorelines. Pillboxes, coastal artillery batteries, machine gun nests dug into the beach approaches, any visible wire obstacles or barrier constructions, observation posts positioned to direct defensive fire against landing craft. The targeting was methodical to the degree that intelligence allowed, drawing on aerial reconnaissance photography, submarine periscope observation, and whatever information could be assembled about Japanese construction activity along the coast. Some of it was imprecise. Targets that appeared on reconnaissance photographs as gun positions turned out to be dummies. Targets that appeared to have been destroyed turned out to have survived in reinforced shelters. The fog of bombardment was its own problem, so much smoke and dust and churned vegetation that subsequent reconnaissance passes struggled to distinguish what had been hit from what remained intact. The human cost inside Guam during those 13 days is not reducible to clean numbers. Japanese records, to the extent they survived the campaign at all, were fragmentary and inconsistent. But the cumulative effect of sustained naval bombardment on a garrison that had expected it and nevertheless could not entirely prepare for its intensity was severe. Men died in collapsed bunkers. Men died at their posts in coastal positions that had been identified and systematically engaged. Men died in the fires that consumed supply depots and the secondary explosions that followed when ammunition stores were struck. The bombardment also generated casualties of a more insidious kind. Men whose positions were not directly struck, but who endured days of near-constant concussion and noise and the psychological weight of knowing that the ships offshore could reach them wherever they chose to shelter, that there was no position so prepared, no bunker so reinforced, that it guaranteed survival. Endurance under that kind of pressure is not the same thing as readiness to fight. The garrison that would face the landing force on the 21st of July had been worn in ways that did not show up in a head count. Yet for all its power, the bombardment could not solve the fundamental problem that Guam's terrain presented to any attacker. The island's interior, the ridgelines rising toward Mount Lamlam, the dense jungle canopy that concealed movement and muffled sound, the ravines and gullies threading through the central highlands, offered a defender advantages that naval gunfire and carrier aircraft could attenuate but never eliminate. Shells do not discriminate effectively in jungle. A hillside fortification that has been struck and appears destroyed can shelter survivors in its rubble. The men planning the landing understood this, and they had not designed the bombardment as a substitute for the fighting to come. It was preparation, not solution. It was meant to reduce the cost of what followed, not to prevent that cost altogether. As the 13th day of bombardment drew toward its close, the feel of the operation began to shift. Fire missions continued, but the focus narrowed toward the final objectives, the beach approaches, the immediate inland terrain, the positions most likely to engage the first waves of landing craft. Aboard the transports and assault vessels carrying the landing force, the sound of the guns had become a constant backdrop to the final preparations. The checking of equipment, the distribution of ammunition, the quiet conversations between men who understood what the morning after next would bring. They had heard the guns working for nearly 2 weeks. They had watched the smoke rising from the island's interior and drawn what comfort they could from the destruction it implied. But they also knew, because men in their position always know, that the island had not surrendered to the bombardment. It had merely been made ready to receive them. The guns had done their work. Now the work would pass to other hands. The 8th of June had begun a conversation between American firepower and Japanese endurance. By the 20th of June, that conversation was ending. What came next would be conducted at a range where neither side could rely on distance for protection, where the question would no longer be how many tons of ordnance could be delivered against a position, but whether the men ordered to take it could reach it, hold it, and survive long enough to matter. The island had been struck, scorched, and shaken to its foundations across nearly 2 weeks of sustained bombardment. It had not been broken. That task, as every man in the invasion fleet understood, belonged to the infantry. The bombardment had been going on for days. From the coastal ridges and the darkened interiors of reinforced bunkers, Japanese soldiers watched the American shells tear into the earth around them, watched the airfields crater, the supply depots burn, the carefully arranged defensive lines along the shore get methodically dismantled from the sea. General Takeshi Takashina did not need a map to understand what the bombardment meant. He had seen enough of the Pacific War to read its logic. The Americans were not merely softening a target, they were announcing an arrival, and the only question that remained was what shape the island's defense would take once they came ashore. He answered that question not with panic, but with cold, professional calculation, and in doing so, he committed his 17,000 remaining soldiers to a plan built on a single brutal truth. Guam could not be saved, but it could be made to cost. That truth had been arriving in pieces for months. By the summer of 1944, the broader strategic situation in the Pacific had shifted in ways that every senior Japanese commander could feel, but few could speak aloud. The great carrier battles had bled the imperial fleet of its finest pilots and most experienced air crews. The island-hopping campaign had torn gaps in the defensive perimeter that Tokyo had once believed impregnable. Guam, which Japanese forces had seized so swiftly and so dramatically in the chaotic days after Pearl Harbor, had spent more than 2 years as a rear area garrison post. Fortified, yes, but never truly tested. The troops who dug into its hills in the summer of 1944 were not the same army that had swept through Southeast Asia in the war's early months. They were older men, soldiers drawn from occupation duties, and replacements rushed forward as the imperial strategic position contracted. They were, however, still soldiers, and Takashina intended to use them with everything he had. The defensive plan he conceived was not passive. It was not simply a matter of waiting behind fixed positions for the Americans to break against prepared lines. Takashina understood fortification as a dynamic tool, and in the weeks before the landings he directed his forces to do something that the Americans, watching from their ships through binoculars and reconnaissance photographs, could only partially see. He pulled strength away from the beaches. Not entirely. There would be resistance at the shoreline, and the initial landings would face fire. But Takashina had absorbed enough of the Pacific War's lessons to understand that an army destroyed at the waterline was an army that provided no return on its investment. The real defense would be in depth, and the terrain of Guam's interior gave him exactly the kind of ground that depth required. The Central Highlands, rising sharply from the coastal plains, were covered in dense jungle, cut by ravines, dotted with limestone caves, and anchored by two features that dominated everything around them: Mount Lam Lam in the south and the Fonte Plateau in the center of the island. These were not just high points on a map, they were natural fortresses, and Takashina ordered them improved into something far more formidable than nature alone had made them. The work was relentless. Through the heat of the Pacific summer, Japanese engineering and infantry units constructed an interlocking network of bunkers, fighting positions, covered firing lanes, and concealed artillery emplacements across the plateau and the surrounding hillsides. Caves that already existed in the limestone karst were deepened, reinforced, and connected to neighboring positions by tunnel sections where the geology permitted. Supply caches were distributed throughout the highland network: ammunition, food, medical supplies, so that no single American strike could simultaneously deprive multiple defensive positions of their ability to fight. This was not improvisation. It reflected a doctrine that Japanese forces had refined on other islands, a doctrine that traded the dramatic satisfaction of repelling landings for the grinding attrition of making every meter of interior terrain cost American blood. Takashina had studied what had happened elsewhere in the Pacific. He intended to do better. The Fonte Plateau was the keystone of everything. Rising more than 300 meters above the surrounding terrain, it commanded views in every direction: north toward Agana, south toward the rugged interior, east toward the landing beaches, west toward the water. Any American force that landed on the western shore and drove inland would eventually have to reckon with the plateau. There was no route around it that did not expose a flanking force to fire from above. Takashina placed his best remaining units on and around the Fonte position, deploying experienced infantry in the prepared bunkers and keeping artillery sighted to cover the approaches. He arranged his forces so that no single American advance could isolate the plateau without itself becoming vulnerable to fire from adjacent positions. It was a carefully considered geometry of death, designed by a man who knew he was fighting for time rather than victory, but who refused to let that distinction diminish the quality of his resistance. Beyond the physical fortifications, Takashina worked to manage the psychological condition of his command. 17,000 soldiers who understood that they were likely to die required something more than orders. They required a framework within which dying made sense, and the Japanese military culture of the era provided that framework in terms Takashina could invoke without hesitation. The defense of Guam was not, in the language he used with his officers, a holding action pending relief. It was an act of sacrifice, whose value was measured not in ground retained, but in American casualties inflicted and American timetables disrupted. Every day the island held was a day the broader American advance was delayed. Every soldier killed in the highlands was one fewer American available for the campaigns that would follow. This arithmetic of attrition was cold and clear, and the men who heard it understood what they were being asked to do. They were not being asked to survive. They were being asked to make their deaths count. Supply distribution consumed weeks of effort and the labor of thousands of men working under the threat of American air attack and naval gunfire. Japanese logistics officers moved stocks of ammunition from coastal depots, already increasingly vulnerable to bombardment, to dispersed positions throughout the interior. Rice and preserved rations were cached in cave systems and concealed storage areas across the highland network. Medical supplies were stockpiled near the Fonte positions, though everyone who handled those supplies understood that the medical capacity to treat seriously wounded soldiers in the weeks ahead would be severely limited. Water sources were identified, mapped, and in some cases improved to ensure that defensive positions could be sustained even after American forces severed the relatively simple supply routes across the island's lower ground. This was meticulous, methodical work carried out by men who had little reason for hope and every reason for professional pride. Takashina also considered the possibility of offensive action, not as a means of defeating the American landings, but as a tool for disrupting American momentum at critical moments. He planned for counterattacks that would strike American forces as they attempted to consolidate beachheads and push inland, hoping to catch them at their most vulnerable, in the chaotic hours immediately after landing, when units were still sorting themselves out on unfamiliar ground. These counterattack forces were held back from the initial coastal defense, kept in reserve in the interior, where American bombardment would find them harder to reach. They were meant to move fast and strike hard at moments of American weakness, and the plan depended on those moments existing, on the landings being sufficiently disorganizing that counterattack forces could find gaps in the American line before those gaps closed. It was an aggressive concept embedded within a fundamentally defensive strategy, and it reflected Takashina's understanding that passive defense alone would simply compress his timetable without meaningfully increasing American costs. The Chamorro population, already enduring more than 2 years of occupation, moved through all of this preparation as a largely silent presence, required to labor, required to comply, required to absorb the consequences of a conflict that had never been theirs. Japanese military authorities directed civilian labor in the construction of defensive works, adding one more layer of suffering to an occupation that had already imposed forced relocations, cultural prohibitions, and the constant pressure of military administration on a people who had lived under American governance for decades before the war. The relationship between occupier and occupied was not a simple one, and the months of occupation had produced a range of experiences, from accommodation to quiet resistance. But by the summer of 1944, the mood among the Chamorro people had shifted. The bombardment was American. The ships on the horizon were American. And whatever the landings would bring, they would bring an end to what had been endured for more than 2 years. Takashina moved his headquarters to a position on the Fonte Plateau, placing himself at the center of the defensive network he had constructed. This was partly practical. Communications were easiest to maintain from a central location, and partly something more deliberate. He was a commander who understood that presence mattered, that soldiers fighting in prepared positions needed to know that their commander shared, at least in some measure, their exposure. The plateau offered no real safety, but it offered command authority, the ability to direct reserves, shift defensive emphasis, and make the decisions that would shape the American experience of fighting through the island's interior. From that position, in the days before the landings began, Takashina could look out over the terrain his soldiers had spent weeks improving and understand, with the clarity that comes from having no illusions, exactly what the coming weeks would demand. He had done everything within his power and resources to make the island's defense as costly as possible. The 17,000 soldiers under his command had dug, reinforced, cached, and prepared. They were as ready as they were going to be. The ocean, to the west and south, was already full of American ships. The wait was nearly over. The pre-dawn darkness over Guam on the 21st of July 1944 hung thick and heavy, pressing down on the men packed into landing craft as they cut through the Philippine Sea toward an island they had never seen. For 13 days, American naval guns had torn into Japanese positions with relentless fury, turning fortified bunkers into rubble and transforming the green landscape into a scarred battlefield, visible even in the grey light before sunrise. The bombardment had been designed to break the will of the Japanese defenders, to destroy their positions, and to suppress their firepower long enough for American Marines and soldiers to establish themselves on the beach. Yet as the landing craft approached the shore, the men understood that bombardment alone could not win battles. That understanding would come only when boots hit sand and bullets began to fly. The assault force numbered more than 55,000 troops, moving toward Asan and Nagana beaches in coordinated waves that represented months of planning, preparation, and logistics that stretched back across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. Everything depended on the next few hours. Everything depended on surprise, speed, and the ability to move inland before the Japanese could consolidate their scattered forces and launch devastating counterattacks. The naval commanders had timed the landing to achieve maximum advantage, early morning hours when darkness still provided cover, but dawn allowed enough visibility for officers to direct their men. The beaches themselves were relatively narrow, funneling the assault force into a compressed front, where congestion and confusion could prove as deadly as Japanese fire. Yet American planners had studied the terrain for weeks, analyzed every available photograph and intelligence report, and positioned their forces to minimize the inherent chaos of amphibious operations, where thousands of men moved ashore simultaneously in the fog of war. The first assault waves touched down at Asan Beach as dawn broke across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed obscene given the violence about to unfold on the sand below. Marine units from the 3rd Marine Division splashed ashore in shallow water, their weapons held high, their eyes scanning the tree line for movement, for muzzle flashes, for the eruption of defensive fire they had been trained to expect. The bombardment had done its work better than anyone dared hope. The beach itself was relatively quiet, the concussive roar of shells having driven many Japanese defenders inland or killed them where they stood in prepared positions along the shore. Officers shouted commands, non-commissioned officers pushed men forward, and within minutes the beach was crowded with armed soldiers and Marines, establishing a perimeter, moving inland, and clearing the immediate area of mines and obstacles. Engineers worked frantically to clear lanes through the surf zone, marking safe passages for the subsequent waves of troops and the landing craft that would follow. The density of men on the beach increased by the minute. Ammunition bearers, machine gun crews, riflemen, support troops, all flowing ashore in organized chaos that somehow avoided complete catastrophe. The Japanese, despite their preparations, had been caught off balance by the bombardment that had forced them to abandon many forward positions and fall back to secondary defensive lines deeper in the jungle. The American assault achieved what every commander dreams of in an amphibious operation: tactical surprise despite weeks of visible preparation, despite the entire Japanese garrison knowing an invasion was coming. The combination of naval gunfire, air bombardment, and the sheer weight of American firepower converging on the island had so thoroughly disrupted Japanese command and control that organized resistance at the beach simply failed to materialize with the ferocity that might have been expected. Simultaneously, at Agana Beach, several kilometers to the north, soldiers from the Army's 77th Infantry Division were coming ashore in their own assault, establishing their own beachhead and beginning their own push inland toward the island's capital. The operation was coordinated but not sequential. Both landings occurred in the same narrow window of time to divide Japanese attention, prevent reinforcement of either beach, and ensure that American forces achieved sufficient depth and numbers ashore before the enemy could mount a unified response. Agana itself lay just inland from the beach, offering American commanders a psychological prize alongside military advantage. The capital of Guam, however small and however ravaged by bombardment, represented the seat of authority on the island. The landing beaches themselves were not ideal for amphibious operations, being somewhat narrow and backed by terrain that rose steeply in places, creating natural choke points where a determined enemy could inflict terrible casualties on troops moving inland. But the naval bombardment had demolished many of the prepared positions that might have dominated these choke points, killing or dispersing defenders who had spent weeks preparing their defenses. The initial casualty reports trickling back to the command ships anchored offshore were far lighter than the pessimistic estimates that had circulated in planning sessions. The American forces had expected far heavier losses in the first hours ashore, and the relative success of the initial landings boosted morale among commanders already tensing for the grinding campaign they knew lay ahead. By mid-morning, thousands of troops were ashore at both beachheads, establishing consolidated positions, pushing reconnaissance units inland to probe for Japanese defensive positions, and working to expand the beachhead perimeter. The amphibious assault, that most difficult of all military operations, had succeeded in its opening act. American forces had achieved a lodgment on the island, secured their initial objectives, and prevented the catastrophic failure that could have turned the entire operation into a nightmare of bloodshed and retreat. Yet even as American officers surveyed their success and sent reports confirming the secure establishment of beachheads back to higher command, the real battle was just beginning in the interior of the island, where Japanese forces were regrouping and preparing counterattacks designed to drive American forces back into the sea. The quiet that had characterized the beaches in the opening hours was deceptive. It masked feverish activity across the island as Japanese units fell back to predetermined defensive lines, consolidated their forces, and prepared to contest every kilometer of American advance. General Takashina, commanding the Japanese garrison, had anticipated that American forces would land on the southern and western beaches of the island, areas that offered the best approaches for amphibious assault and the most logical objectives for an invading force. His strategy was not to contest the beach itself with every available man, but to accept the initial American landings and then compress his defensive perimeter around the inland highlands, particularly the Fonte Plateau and Mount Lamlam, where terrain and pre-positioned defenses could extract maximum casualties from advancing American forces. The initial hours after the American landings saw Japanese forces executing tactical retreats that were carefully controlled rather than panicked. Units withdrew from coastal positions in organized fashion, carrying supplies and equipment when possible, destroying or concealing ammunition and provisions they could not move. The speed of this tactical response reflected the training and discipline of the Japanese military, even as it acknowledged the grim reality that organized resistance on the beaches and in the coastal lowlands was no longer tactically sustainable once the Americans had achieved sufficient numbers ashore. American reconnaissance units pushing inland through the first day of the operation encountered scattered resistance rather than coordinated defensive lines. Snipers in trees, machine gun nests that had somehow survived the bombardment, isolated groups of Japanese soldiers fighting delaying actions designed to slow American advance rather than to stop it entirely. These encounters gave individual men their first taste of real combat on Guam, transformed the abstract operation into personal terror and adrenaline, and began to impose casualties on American forces that would accumulate steadily as the campaign progressed inland. By the end of the first day, American forces had achieved far more than merely establishing beachheads. They had secured rough positions roughly 2 kilometers inland, enough depth to prevent Japanese coastal counterattacks from driving them back into the sea, and enough space to land follow-up forces and build up supplies and ammunition for the push into the interior. The beaches themselves had transformed into bustling logistics hubs where landing craft streamed in and out in endless succession, disgorging troops, equipment, ammunition, rations, and all the vast material requirements of modern warfare. Amphibious supply operations were complex and vulnerable endeavors, and American commanders moved carefully to build sufficient reserves ashore to sustain offensive operations while remaining prepared for Japanese counterattacks that might disrupt the landing beaches and cut them off from supply. The first night ashore was tense and watchful, with American units digging in along their perimeter, establishing defensive positions, placing out sentries, and bracing for the counterattacks that intelligence officers expected the Japanese to launch under cover of darkness. American troops, many experiencing combat for the first time, gripped their rifles and stared out into the darkness, straining to hear movement in the jungle, flinching at every sound, their nerves drawn tight by adrenaline and fear, and the knowledge that death might come from any direction. The Chamorro people, emerging from hiding places in caves and fortified areas where they had sheltered from the bombardment, watched the American landings with emotions that mixed relief, hope, and uncertainty about the violence yet to come. Many had been subjected to harsh treatment during the Japanese occupation, forced into labor battalions, separated from families, and subjected to the casual cruelties that characterized Japanese military administration. Yet they also understood that the arrival of American forces meant the island would become a battleground where civilians would inevitably suffer alongside soldiers in the chaos of warfare. As darkness fell on the first day of the operation, American commanders assessed their situation with cautious satisfaction, tempered by awareness of the difficult campaign ahead. The initial objectives had been achieved. The amphibious assault had succeeded. The beachheads were established and reasonably secure. Casualties had been lighter than feared, and sufficient forces had been landed to begin the offensive push inland. Yet the Japanese, though driven from their coastal positions, remained a formidable force in control of the interior highlands where terrain and preparation gave them significant defensive advantages. American commanders knew from intelligence reports and from interrogation of prisoners that General Takashina commanded roughly 17,000 troops, that these forces were disciplined and well-trained, and that they had spent weeks fortifying positions in the interior of the island. The next phase of the campaign would not be the rapid collapse of Japanese defenses that optimistic officers sometimes whispered about in planning sessions. It would instead be a grinding offensive against an enemy that would trade terrain for time, that would extract maximum casualties from American forces, and that would fight with the desperation of men who knew they could not win, but were culturally conditioned to die rather than surrender. The initial success of the amphibious landings had been necessary, but was ultimately only prologue to the real battle that would unfold across the jungles and highlands of Guam in the days and weeks ahead. American forces had crossed the threshold from preparation to commitment, from planning to execution, from hope to the grinding reality of combat, where theories collided with the brutal simplicity of killing and dying. The battle for Guam had begun in earnest, and there was no turning back. The landing beaches on the 21st of July had proven, against expectations, surprisingly secure. American forces had established themselves in the dark hours before dawn, and by the time full light broke across the island, thousands of troops had waded ashore, driven inland through the initial defensive fire, and begun to consolidate positions in the beachhead zones. Yet the true test of the invasion was not the landing itself, but what came next. The inexorable push inland through terrain that grew progressively more hostile, more complex, and more dangerous with every kilometer gained. The next 72 hours would reveal whether the massive American assault could sustain its momentum, or whether the Japanese, even fractured and demoralized by the preliminary bombardment, could reorganize enough to extract a catastrophic price from the invaders. The first challenge facing American commanders in those critical early hours was not the enemy, but logistics. The grinding, unglamorous work of moving hundreds of tons of supplies, ammunition, medical equipment, and reinforcements from the ships anchored offshore onto beaches that quickly became congested with vehicles, equipment, and men. Combat engineers worked with methodical intensity to clear beach obstacles that the Japanese had emplaced before the bombardment, removing mines and anti-landing devices that still posed a threat to the steady stream of landing craft returning to unload their cargo. Supply officers coordinated the flow of ammunition to forward units, understanding that without steady replenishment, the assault inland would collapse. Quartermaster sections established dump sites for food, water, and medical supplies just beyond the beach, building stockpiles against the inevitable demands of an expanding battle. The engineers simultaneously worked to improve the beaches themselves, leveling obstacles, removing debris, and preparing exits that would allow vehicles to move inland without bottlenecking. Progress measured in meters per hour may have seemed glacial to observers, but it was the invisible foundation upon which the entire offensive rested. Inland from the beaches, American infantry and marine units pushed forward in loose formations, their tactics refined through months of island warfare, but never certain against an enemy whose defensive cunning had improved with each successive American assault. The terrain immediately inland from Asan and Nagana presented both obstacles and opportunities. Dense jungle vegetation that slowed movement and allowed defenders to remain hidden until the last moment, but also ravines and natural cover that could protect advancing units if they moved with care. Japanese resistance in these early hours was scattered and fragmented, units separated from their chain of command by the bombardment and unsure of the overall situation. Small groups of defenders ambushed advancing Americans from fortified positions, inflicting casualties that mounted steadily as units pushed deeper into territory that Japanese engineers had spent weeks preparing. Machine gun fire erupted from concealed positions in the jungle. Mortar rounds began falling into advancing formations. Determined small unit leaders organized local counterattacks that forced American units to call for supporting fire and consolidate their positions. Each day of the first 72 hours brought fresh casualties and fresh lessons about how dangerous this campaign would become if Japanese resistance could be organized and concentrated. The American forces operating inland during these crucial hours faced an opponent they could see only rarely and could engage only when they stumbled directly into prepared positions. Squad leaders learned quickly to move slowly, to scout ahead carefully, and to use every ridge and vegetation feature to mask their movements from defenders who might be waiting in the jungle. Forward observers called in artillery fire and mortar fire on suspected Japanese positions, and the constant thunder of supporting fire became the heartbeat of the inland campaign, a rhythm that would persist for weeks. Scout and reconnaissance platoons probed the advancing lines, seeking gaps and weak points in Japanese defensive lines while suffering casualties that seemed disproportionate to their small numbers. Tank units that had come ashore in the initial waves attempted to move forward to support infantry, but the dense terrain and the maze of Japanese anti-tank positions made vehicles as much a liability as an asset in close terrain. American soldiers learned that this would be an infantryman's war, decided by men on foot moving through oppressive heat and humidity, fighting an enemy they could not see and could not predict. General Roy Geiger, commanding the 3rd Marine Division that had landed at Agana, faced a situation that required both aggressive exploitation of the initial beachhead success and careful consolidation to prevent overextension and disaster. He committed his reserves not all at once but in measured increments, reinforcing success where Japanese resistance was lighter, while building up strength to assault positions where defenders appeared more heavily concentrated. His command post ashore managed the flow of incoming units, coordinated fire support from naval gunfire and aircraft that orbited constantly above the island, and maintained contact with the 10th Army command structure that was managing the overall campaign. Geiger understood that the first 72 hours would establish the tempo of the entire campaign, move too slowly, and the Japanese would complete their withdrawal into the highlands, move too fast, and the supply lines would break, leaving advancing units cut off and vulnerable. The balance he sought was aggressive caution, pushing hard enough to keep the Japanese from organizing, but carefully enough to prevent catastrophe. The logistics officers supporting the invasion during these early days labored under constraints that would have paralyzed a less experienced command structure. The beaches were limited in capacity. The harbor facilities that existed were damaged or destroyed. The ships offshore had limited capacity to sustain an operation ashore if there was any delay in establishing proper supply infrastructure. Every piece of equipment that came ashore had to be tracked, counted, and accounted for. Ammunition had to be distributed according to combat demands. Water had to be supplied to troops operating in tropical heat that drained men faster than any enemy action. Jeeps and trucks were landing, but the roads that the Japanese had built were destroyed or blocked by debris. Engineers had to clear routes and, in some cases, carve new paths through the jungle. The medical supply officers worked frantically to establish aid stations close enough to the fighting to treat casualties quickly, but far enough back to be relatively secure. Water purification teams worked to establish sources of fresh water that could replace the carefully rationed supplies being brought ashore. The total logistical machinery would eventually involve thousands of personnel working night and day to support perhaps 10,000 men actually engaged in combat. By the end of the first full day ashore, American forces had established an uninterrupted beachhead stretching roughly 5 kilometers along the western coast and extending inland between 1 and 2 kilometers on average. Losses had been lighter than expected, perhaps 125 killed and several hundred wounded in the initial assault, but the losses mounted steadily as units moved inland. Japanese counterattacks, hastily organized and increasingly desperate, struck against the expanding American positions throughout the afternoon and evening, probing for weakness and attempting to drive the invaders back into the sea. These attacks failed, but they imposed casualties on both sides and reinforced a growing American understanding that the Japanese garrison, despite the devastating bombardment, retained far more combat capability than some planners had anticipated. Battalion commanders consolidated their positions as darkness fell on the 21st, improving fortifications, establishing guard positions, and ensuring that ammunition and supplies were distributed throughout the lines. The men dug in deeper, understanding that the night might bring Japanese infiltration or even organized counterattack, though experience and intelligence gradually made clear that major Japanese night operations were becoming increasingly rare. The second and third days of the campaign unfolded with grinding intensity as American forces expanded their beachhead and pushed inland toward the town of Agana, which lay roughly 6 kilometers from the landing beaches. The advance followed established doctrine, with infantry units moving forward in waves, supported by artillery fire and frequent requests for close air support from Navy and Marine fighters orbiting overhead. Japanese resistance stiffened noticeably as American forces pushed deeper inland, encountering more heavily prepared positions and units that appeared to be acting under coordinated command. The commanding generals received increasingly detailed intelligence about Japanese defensive positions from reconnaissance elements and captured prisoners, intelligence that helped identify where the main Japanese defensive lines were forming. Casualty rates climbed as Americans pushed closer to the town, passing through villages where Japanese soldiers fought from prepared positions, caves, and concealed bunkers. Engineers continued their work, clearing routes for supply convoys and attempting to establish water points and ammunition caches that would support the growing battle. Occasionally, Americans overran supply dumps or medical facilities that the Japanese had established before the bombardment, capturing documents and supplies that provided additional insight into Japanese force disposition and intentions. The commanders pushing inland during these 72 hours were learning lessons about their own men and about the enemy simultaneously. They discovered which officers and sergeants had the tactical judgment to move forward without taking unnecessary casualties, which ones understood how to use fire support effectively, and which ones needed closer supervision. They learned which unit could move most quickly through the dense jungle, which ones could sustain operations with minimal supply, which ones cracked under the pressure of mounting casualties. At the same time, they were learning about the Japanese defenders, how they had positioned their forces before the bombardment, where the most effective defensive positions seemed to be located, how quickly they could mount organized counterattacks. Some Japanese units appeared to be falling back in organized fashion, retreating toward pre-planned defensive positions in the interior. Others seemed fragmented and desperate, conducting final stands rather than conducting tactical withdrawals. The information gathered in these 3 days would prove invaluable in planning the subsequent assault on the highland positions, providing commanders with tactical knowledge that reconnaissance could never fully deliver. Supply lines inland remained tenuous and vulnerable throughout the first 72 hours, requiring constant attention and reinforcement as units advancing inland consumed ammunition and rations at higher rates than planners had estimated. Truck companies worked to establish supply routes from the beaches to forward positions, using captured Japanese roads where possible and creating new routes where necessary. Water trucks followed advancing units, providing the fresh water that was increasingly critical as tropical heat took its toll on American troops. Ammunition resupply became an ongoing crisis as units called for supporting fire with increasing frequency, drawing down reserves faster than trucks could replenish them. The first casualty evacuation helicopters were not yet available in the Pacific Theater, so wounded men had to be carried back to aid stations on the shoulders of their fellows or conveyed on improvised stretchers, a process that was slow and taxing on the healthy men doing the carrying. Medical personnel worked continuously to treat the growing numbers of wounded, performing emergency surgery in dusty aid stations located as close to the fighting as circumstances permitted. Surgeons operating under canvas during the heat of the day and night had to work with limited supplies and increasingly crowded conditions as the casualty flow increased. By the 3rd day of the campaign, American commanders possessed a clearer picture of Japanese dispositions and realized that the main body of defending forces had successfully disengaged from the beach areas and was establishing itself in the central highlands, particularly around Mount Lamlam and the Fonte Plateau. The beachhead was now secure enough that no realistic possibility existed of Japanese driving the Americans back into the sea. The question was no longer whether the Americans would hold Guam, but rather how long it would take to eliminate the remaining Japanese forces, and at what cost. The expanding beachhead now contained roughly 40,000 American troops ashore, with thousands more landing each day from the ships anchored offshore. Airfields that the Japanese had built were being rapidly rehabilitated, allowing American aircraft to operate with greater endurance and more consistent support for ground units. Supply dumps grew increasingly large and organized, creating reserves of ammunition and rations that would support the grinding campaign into the interior. Tent cities arose behind the beachhead areas as headquarters sections, support units, and supply personnel established themselves in permanent-looking camps that would serve the needs of the expanding force. Engineers began the work of establishing a hospital facility ashore, a major undertaking that would eventually handle the steady flow of American wounded and also serve the growing number of Chamorro civilians who required medical care. The consolidation that took place during these first 72 hours established the foundation for everything that would follow: the logistics networks that would support the campaign, the command relationships that would control operations, the supply reserves that would enable sustained operations. American losses during these 3 days had been surprisingly light, considering the scope of the operation. Some 700 killed and wounded total, and commanders recognized that this relatively favorable exchange of casualties resulted partly from the careful planning that had preceded the assault, and partly from good fortune. The Japanese losses had been far heavier, thousands killed in the bombardment and in the fighting ashore, and the remaining defenders had lost cohesion and the opportunity to mount a coordinated defense of the beaches. By the time the third day of the campaign ended, the Americans had clearly won the beachhead battle and had established themselves firmly on Guam. The question now was whether they could maintain momentum and drive the Japanese from the highlands, or whether the enemy would be able to organize an effective defense in terrain that strongly favored the defender. The grinding campaign was about to begin in earnest, as American forces prepared to drive inland toward the mountains and the main Japanese force, ready to trade the relatively light casualties of the landing and beachhead consolidation for the heavier casualties that mountain warfare would surely demand. In the wake of the initial landings, American forces pressed inland with steadily growing confidence. The beachheads at Asan and Agana had held firm against Japanese counterattacks, and supply ships continued to stream toward the island, unloading ammunition, food, and reinforcements in an unbroken procession. The momentum was shifting in America's favor, a momentum that pulled the entire weight of the assault force toward the island's interior and toward Agana, the capital, which sat roughly 8 kilometers southwest of the Asan landing zone. Agana represented more than just a geographic objective. It was the administrative heart of Guam, the seat of colonial governance before the war, and its capture would demonstrate to both the American public and the troops themselves that the island was truly being retaken. Japanese forces understood this significance as well, and they had prepared the town for a fighting withdrawal, establishing defensive positions throughout the streets and buildings while maintaining interior lines of retreat toward the highlands. The stage was set for urban combat of a kind that had become grimly familiar to Pacific War veterans. The brutal, close-quarters fighting that reduced buildings to rubble and consumed men in ways that terrain-based warfare did not. The approach to Agana began in earnest on the 22nd of July, just 1 day after the landings. American infantry units moving southwest from their beachheads encountered increasingly organized Japanese resistance as they drew closer to the town, with defending forces conducting a fighting retreat through the intermediate terrain. The Japanese were not attempting to hold a continuous line, but rather to conduct a series of delaying actions, inflicting casualties on the advancing Americans, while slowly withdrawing toward prepared positions within Agana itself. Each village and strongpoint along the approach cost American lives, yet each successful bypass or assault also inflicted grievous losses on the defenders, steadily wearing away at their fighting strength. The men advancing on Agana faced not only enemy fire but also the physical demands of the terrain, the heat and humidity of the tropics, the weight of their equipment, the psychological weight of knowing that urban combat ahead would be more dangerous than anything they had yet faced on Guam. By the 23rd of July, American forces had pushed to within striking distance of the town, and commanders began coordinating the assault that would unfold over the next 3 days. The attack on Agana itself commenced on the 24th of July with a carefully orchestrated bombardment designed to suppress Japanese defensive positions without destroying the town's civilian infrastructure unnecessarily. Artillery units positioned southwest of the landing zones poured fire into designated targets throughout the day, while naval gunfire support from offshore vessels added their weight to the assault. The bombardment was more measured than the general preliminary bombardment that had raged across the island for 13 days prior, the intent being to weaken Japanese defenses while preserving buildings that American forces would shortly need to occupy and use as shelter. Yet even with this restraint, the shelling caused significant damage to Agana's structures, and the smoke and dust that rose from the town obscured the landscape and made observation difficult for both the attackers planning their assault and the defenders trying to mount effective resistance. Japanese commanders within the town directed their forces to maintain their positions despite the bombardment, knowing that premature withdrawal would hand the Americans an easier conquest. Through the afternoon and into the evening of the 24th, the artillery continued its work, softening the ground for the infantry assault that everyone knew would come with the dawn. Street-by-street fighting began on the 25th of July, as American infantry units entered the outer reaches of Agana and began the grim work of clearing buildings and checking for Japanese defenders. The town's layout worked against the attackers: narrow streets, buildings with multiple stories that provided vantage points for defenders, and the inevitable civilian population caught in the middle, adding moral complexity to every decision made by American commanders and soldiers. Japanese defenders had prepared interior positions using civilian structures, establishing fields of fire across streets, and setting booby traps in anticipation of American troops moving through the town. The intensity of the fighting varied from block to block. Some areas saw only scattered resistance, while others erupted into fierce firefights as Japanese soldiers emerged from concealed positions to contest American advances. American soldiers learned quickly to move carefully through each building, to check adjacent structures for enfilading fire, and to proceed methodically despite the desire to move forward and complete the operation. Casualties mounted on both sides as the fighting progressed. Americans killed and wounded while clearing buildings, Japanese soldiers dying in their defensive positions or being captured, and civilians who could not flee finding themselves trapped in the crossfire between military forces fighting across their homes. The advance through Agana required coordination between infantry units moving through the streets and supporting elements positioned to provide covering fire and suppress enemy positions that threatened forward progress. Machine gun teams established positions on rooftops and in reinforced windows, laying down fire patterns designed to keep Japanese defenders suppressed while American infantry units advanced. Tank support, though limited by the narrow streets and the risk of friendly fire in an urban environment, provided firepower to deal with fortified positions that infantry could not assault directly without unacceptable casualties. Engineering teams worked to clear rubble from streets, to establish routes for supply elements and ammunition resupply, and to prepare positions for defense against potential Japanese counterattacks. Communications among units were critical, as the urban terrain fragmented command and control, making it difficult for officers to maintain oversight of scattered squad-sized elements engaged in combat throughout the town. Radio operators worked constantly, relaying information up and down the chain of command, coordinating artillery and air support, and attempting to maintain the overall operational picture as the battle unfolded across Agana's streets. By the 25th, American forces had established significant presence within Agana, though resistance continued in several pockets throughout the town. Japanese commanders, recognizing that Agana could not be held indefinitely against American numerical and firepower superiority, began executing their planned withdrawal toward interior defensive positions. This withdrawal was not a rout, but an organized military operation, with defending forces conducting careful rearguard actions designed to inflict maximum damage on the pursuing Americans while preserving as much of their force as possible for future resistance in the highlands. Small groups of Japanese soldiers would establish positions, slow the American advance, then withdraw to the next prepared position as American fire grew too intense to resist. This leapfrog withdrawal extended the fighting for another day and a half, as American forces had to clear each position methodically rather than rushing through the town and potentially walking into ambushes or counterattacks. The toll on American forces mounted steadily through the 25th and into the 26th, with medics and hospital units becoming increasingly stretched as wounded accumulated. The final collapse of organized Japanese resistance in Agana occurred on the 26th of July, when American forces fought their way to the town's center and occupied the key administrative buildings and defensive strongpoints. Japanese defenders still present in the town realized that withdrawal was no longer possible and either surrendered or died fighting. Some Japanese soldiers, choosing death over surrender, engaged in final suicidal attacks against American positions, charging across open ground toward entrenched Americans, knowing the outcome was predetermined, but acting according to their military code and the ideology that had shaped them. The sight of these attacks shook American soldiers, who had grown accustomed to fierce resistance, but less prepared for the apparent willingness of Japanese soldiers to seek death rather than accept defeat. By mid-afternoon on the 26th, American commanders declared Agana secured, and the American flag was raised over the administrative center of the reclaimed island. The symbolism was not lost on anyone who witnessed it or heard about it. The capital of Guam was once again under American control. The occupation that had lasted more than 2 years had been broken, and American military might had proven sufficient to retake what had been lost. The human cost of retaking Agana was substantial, though the scale of American casualties was less than commanders had feared. Nearly 800 Americans had been killed or wounded during the 3-day battle for the town, a significant price for what was ultimately a supporting operation in the larger campaign for the island. Japanese losses were far heavier. More than 2,000 soldiers had been killed or captured during the fighting in and around Agana, representing a substantial portion of the defensive garrison. The civilian population had suffered as well, though the exact toll was difficult to determine in the chaos of combat and the confusion of the immediate aftermath. Many Chamorro residents had fled the town ahead of the fighting, seeking shelter in the interior highlands or in concealed locations they hoped would be safer than remaining in Agana. Those who remained often found themselves trapped between Japanese defenders and American attackers, and some perished in the crossfire or from stray ordnance regardless of which side was firing. The reconstruction of civilian life in Agana would take months and years, and the psychological scars of occupation and combat would not heal for generations. The capture of Agana transformed the American logistical position on Guam in critical ways. The town's port facilities, though damaged, could be restored and put to use, bringing in supplies and reinforcements more efficiently than the beachheads at Asan. The administrative infrastructure, despite the damage inflicted by bombardment and street fighting, provided spaces where American commanders could establish headquarters and coordinate operations across the island. The symbolic weight of controlling the capital bolstered American morale, as soldiers advancing toward the highlands knew they were fighting in reconquered territory, not in enemy-held land. Communications improved as American signals units established secure facilities in Agana, and the town became a hub through which supplies, orders, and information flowed. Medical facilities were established in less damaged buildings, allowing American medical personnel to treat the growing number of wounded more effectively than had been possible in forward aid stations. The occupation of Agana thus represented both a tactical milestone and a strategic gain, accelerating the overall tempo of the American campaign against the remaining Japanese defenders in the highlands. Yet the fall of Agana, decisive as it was, did not signal the imminent end of the fighting on Guam. Japanese forces retreating from the town did not fragment into disorganized bands, but rather withdrew in disciplined fashion toward previously prepared defensive positions in the Central Highlands, particularly around Mount Lamlam and the Fonte Plateau. General Takashina's main defensive line remained intact despite the loss of the town, and he maintained sufficient force and supplies to conduct a protracted defense in the rugged terrain where American numerical and logistical advantages would be less decisive. American commanders understood this reality, even as they celebrated the capture of Agana and reported the success to higher command. The fighting in the highlands would be more difficult, more costly, and more protracted than the fighting in Agana or along the initial approaches to the beachheads. The momentum that had carried American forces into and through Agana would now crash against prepared defensive positions in terrain that had been extensively fortified and where every meter of advance would have to be fought for and paid for with American blood. The destruction inflicted on Agana during the three-day battle was considerable, leaving scars that would remain visible on the town's buildings and landscape for years to come. Artillery bombardment and street-by-street fighting had reduced much of the civilian infrastructure to rubble or severely damaged structures. Administrative buildings bore the marks of combat, their walls pockmarked with bullet holes and shrapnel wounds, their roofs collapsed in places from indirect fire. Residential areas where American and Japanese forces had fought showed similar patterns of destruction. The psychological impact of seeing their capital city torn apart by war was significant for the Chamorro population, even though they understood that American forces had fought to liberate them from Japanese occupation. The restoration of civilian governance and the return of normalcy to Agana would be a slow process, complicated by the ongoing military campaign in the island's interior and the arrival of American military personnel and infrastructure that would be required to support operations against Japan. By the evening of the 26th of July, as American soldiers began consolidating their positions in Agana and preparing for the next phase of the campaign, the nature of the struggle on Guam had fundamentally shifted. The amphibious phase of the operation was complete. The beachhead had been expanded and consolidated, and the capital had been recaptured. What remained was the defeat of the main Japanese defensive force in the highlands, a task that commanders knew would take additional days, weeks of fighting, rather than the days that had been required to capture Agana. The troops advancing toward the interior understood that the worst of the fighting still lay ahead, that they would face entrenched defenders in terrain that favored the defense, and that the casualty lists would continue to grow as American forces pressed toward final victory. Yet they also knew that momentum was with them, that American firepower was overwhelming, and that the Japanese position, despite its apparent strength, was fundamentally doomed by the arithmetic of war. The capture of Agana symbolized this transformation. The war was no longer being fought to secure a foothold on the island. It was now being fought to completely destroy Japanese capability, to resist, and to fully restore Guam to American control. The 26th of July marked a threshold. Agana had fallen. American forces held the capital, and with it, the symbolic heart of Guam's colonial administration. Yet as commanders studied their maps and surveyed the terrain stretching southwestward into the island's interior, they confronted a landscape that would demand everything their troops could give. The path ahead led toward Mount Lamlam, rising above the surrounding terrain like a sentinel over the central highlands. It was not simply a mountain to be climbed. It was the anchor point of General Takashina's final defensive line, the Fonte Plateau, a natural fortress that would test American resolve in ways the beach landings had not. The Japanese commander had spent months preparing this ground, transforming terrain into a barrier of concrete and steel, artillery, and determined men. What awaited the American divisions was not a retreat into chaos, but a carefully constructed stronghold designed to exact maximum cost for every meter of advance. The distances involved seemed modest by the standards of European warfare, perhaps 12 to 15 kilometers from the American beachheads to the Fonte Plateau itself. Yet in the Central Pacific context, with terrain that channeled movement and concealment that favored defense, those kilometers represented an immense strategic gap. Supply lines would stretch thin as American forces moved deeper inland, away from their ships and the relative security of the beaches. Engineers labored continuously to improve roads and pathways barely worthy of the name, carving routes through jungle and coral that had resisted human passage for centuries. Trucks moved slowly, vulnerable to ambush and Japanese artillery that still possessed ammunition and the will to use it. Every advance exposed supply columns to fire from hillsides where observers watched and waited, calculating distances and feeding coordinates to gun crews ensconced in fortified positions. The logistics of the campaign would prove as consequential as the combat itself. Ammunition had to reach forward positions, casualties had to be evacuated, and food and water had to sustain troops operating in tropical heat that drained energy and will. The terrain itself became an opponent as formidable as the soldiers defending it. Unlike the relatively open terrain around the beaches, the interior of Guam presented a world of dense jungle, sharp coral ridges, and ravines that seemed to multiply with each kilometer inland. The vegetation grew so thickly in places that visibility extended only meters, reducing warfare to small unit engagements, where American advantages in artillery and air support held diminished value. Japanese defenders had learned from months of occupation and bombardment that exposed positions meant death, yet prepared positions in caves and tunnels offered protection that no amount of shells could fully compromise. They had cached supplies in multiple locations, ensuring that even if one cache was discovered and destroyed, others remained hidden deeper in the jungle and higher on the ridges. The intelligence sections of American divisions understood this, yet knowledge did not translate into easy solutions. Patrols had to probe carefully, locating concentrations of enemy forces through patient reconnaissance, rather than assuming the enemy would simply retreat before American firepower. As American units pushed inland during the closing days of July, the true scope of Japanese preparation became apparent. The Fonte Plateau, roughly 300 meters above the surrounding terrain, commanded the landscape in all directions, offering observers a vantage point from which every American movement could be tracked and reported. The Japanese had positioned their best remaining units across this defensive line, troops who understood that this would be their final stand, that there would be no evacuation, no withdrawal to secondary positions. General Takashina had distributed his remaining artillery across multiple positions, ensuring interlocking fields of fire that meant no American approach could avoid concentrated firepower. Mortar crews positioned on the plateau's flanks could pour fire down into ravines and valleys where American units necessarily had to concentrate to assault the high ground. Machine gun nests, carefully sighted and mutually supporting, created zones of overlapping fire that would tear into advancing infantry with mechanical precision. The Japanese had studied American tactics during months of observation from their defensive positions, understanding that American commanders relied on heavy firepower and frontal assaults backed by artillery bombardment. The American push toward Lam Lam proceeded with deliberate pressure rather than haste. Divisional commanders understood that rushing the plateau would result in catastrophic casualties that would serve no strategic purpose. The Japanese could not escape, could not reinforce, could not be relieved by counterattack from other positions. Time favored the American force despite its apparent disadvantage in terrain, because time meant more artillery arriving, more ammunition being stockpiled, more reconnaissance being conducted. Yet haste also carried risks, because every day of delay meant more casualties from Japanese counterattacks against American positions, more wear and tear on troops already exhausted by heat, effort, and the psychological weight of combat in dense jungle. The commanders therefore pursued a strategy of steady, relentless pressure. Each day saw American units advance 2 or 3 kilometers, consolidate their positions, and prepare for the following day's push. This mechanical persistence, less dramatic than sudden breakthroughs, proved more effective against an enemy that could not be outflanked because geography provided no flanks, only ridgelines and plateaus to be captured one by one. Artillery became the voice of American superiority during this phase of the campaign. Howitzers and guns of all calibers registered positions covering the routes toward the plateau, and as American infantry encountered Japanese strongpoints, fire support officers called down strikes that shook the earth and destroyed fortifications that weeks of preparation had created. The sound of artillery fire, constant and overwhelming, became the ambient noise of the campaign, thunder in the tropical climate that announced American presence and power. Japanese soldiers in caves and bunkers endured this bombardment with limited ability to respond, conserving ammunition for targets they could actually strike, watching as shell after shell pounded their positions and reduced prepared defenses to rubble. Yet the terrain itself offered protection that no amount of artillery could entirely eliminate. Caves that penetrated deep into the ridges, fortifications buried in coral, and tunnel systems connecting multiple strongpoints ensured that for every position destroyed, another intact position remained. American infantry, advancing behind the artillery barrage, still encountered fire and had to assault positions that had weathered bombardment and remained defended. The Chamorro population encountered during the American push inland existed in a liminal space between war and civilian life, caught between occupiers and liberators, unable to know with certainty which force represented safety. Some Japanese soldiers, recognizing the collapse of their position, attempted to move through civilian areas, seeking food and shelter from populations they had previously terrorized during the occupation. American troops, moving into areas recently cleared of Japanese forces, found evidence of occupation's harshness, destroyed homes, abandoned Japanese equipment, and frightened civilians uncertain whether the fighting was truly over or whether new horrors were about to unfold. The language barrier meant misunderstandings could occur with terrible swiftness, and several tragic incidents marred the American advance as frightened civilians fled what they perceived as threats, or misunderstandings led to casualties on both sides. Yet the presence of civilians also constrained American firepower in some areas, requiring infantry assaults in terrain that would otherwise have been saturated with artillery fire. The commanders wrestling with these moral and tactical complexities understood that reclaiming the island meant responsibility for its population, even as the campaign remained undecided and Japanese forces continued to resist. By the first days of August, American divisions faced the Fonte Plateau directly, with their forward positions positioned to assault the plateau's primary defensive line. The Japanese held the high ground, held the interior of the island, and held prepared positions they had months to develop. Yet American forces held the initiative, held superior firepower, held the certainty that reinforcements continued to arrive and resources to sustain the campaign were limitless compared to Japanese supply. This paradox of warfare, superior position versus superior resources, would define the coming struggle for the plateau. American artillery continued to pound Japanese positions around the clock, denying the defenders rest and destroying supplies even when it could not destroy the soldiers themselves. Aerial bombardment added another dimension, with fighters and bombers attacking Japanese positions when weather permitted, though tropical weather meant clouds and rain frequently obscured targets and grounded aircraft. The Americans assembled approximately 35,000 troops for the assault on the plateau, against Japanese forces estimated at 8 to 10,000. The mathematical imbalance was stark, yet terrain and preparation had proven throughout history that numbers alone did not determine battle outcomes. Supply became increasingly critical as American forces pushed deeper into the interior, and distances between front lines and logistics bases grew. Every wounded soldier had to be evacuated back toward medical facilities, a process that required ambulances and jeeps moving through terrain under potential fire, carrying casualties over roads that barely deserved the designation. Food and water, essential in the tropical climate, had to be transported in quantities that seemed to multiply with each kilometer of advance. Ammunition especially had to be brought forward in constant streams. Infantry units fired their weapons in volumes that seemed almost profligate compared to defenders constrained to conserve resources. Yet American firepower doctrine was predicated on overwhelming force, on substituting shells and bullets for the lives of soldiers, on accepting enormous consumption rates as the price of military superiority. The truck convoys that moved along the improving roads toward forward positions represented the sinews of warfare as much as the soldiers who held rifles, and officers had to balance the need to fight with the reality that supply lines created vulnerabilities that Japanese spotters and artillery crews understood precisely. The psychological dimension of the American advance toward Lam Lam should not be underestimated. Soldiers advancing through dense jungle knew that enemies could be anywhere, that the next turn in a trail might bring machine gun fire that ended life without warning or mercy. Officers had to maintain discipline and forward momentum despite the natural human impulse to hesitate and find cover. The constant awareness of danger, the sounds of jungle warfare from nearby units encountering Japanese resistance, and the knowledge that the plateau ahead held thousands of determined defenders created a psychological weight that matched the physical burden of moving through tropical terrain in full combat equipment. Yet momentum, once established, acquired its own force. Units that had gained ground every day found themselves psychologically committed to continuation, and stopping seemed harder than pushing forward. The esprit de corps of units that had landed together, fought together, and endured together created bonds that motivated soldiers to face challenges that would otherwise seem impossible. Leaders, understanding this, nurtured the sense of inevitable progress while also ensuring that advances did not outstrip supply or expose units to unsustainable casualties. As July transformed into August, the outline of coming battles became clear to all participants. American forces had achieved their landing, had broken out of their beachheads, and had pushed inland against weakening but organized Japanese resistance. Yet the main battle remained ahead, against the stronghold on the Fonte Plateau, against an enemy that had prepared this ground for months and understood that this would be their final contest for Guam. General Takashina, still commanding from his positions on the plateau, had concentrated his best remaining forces across the high ground, prepared to trade terrain and time for American casualties. The American commanders, understanding the terrain and the Japanese preparation, had assembled overwhelming forces and accepted that the battle would be grinding and costly. The drive toward Lam Lam was not yet the assault on the plateau itself, but rather the necessary preliminary phase where American forces would position themselves, gather supplies and reinforcements, and prepare for the decisive battle ahead. Every advance through the jungle, every skirmish in a ravine, every American casualty, and every Japanese strongpoint destroyed represented preparation for the coming struggle that would determine the fate of the island and, in ways commanders understood clearly, demonstrate capabilities that would be applied against Japan itself in the months to come. The geography of Guam became Takashina's last argument. While American forces consolidated their beachheads and pushed inland through the first week of August, the Japanese commander had already accepted the inevitable conclusion of the campaign. He could not defeat the invasion fleet. He could not stop the steady flow of American reinforcements, or replace the aircraft and warships destroyed in the preliminary bombardment. What he could do was choose his ground, and in choosing it, he selected the Fonte Plateau, a natural fortress rising more than 300 meters above the surrounding terrain, dominating approaches from all directions and offering the only defensible position left on an island the Americans were systematically dismantling. The plateau commanded the central highlands of Guam like an ancient citadel, and to Takashina, it represented the final opportunity to inflict enough damage on the American advance to preserve Japanese honor, to make the cost of recapture so terrible that it might shape how the victors remembered the campaign. From this elevation, Japanese defenders could observe American movements across miles of jungle and valley floor, direct artillery fire with precision, and force attackers to climb into prepared kill zones, where every advantage belonged to the entrenched garrison. Takashina had spent weeks preparing these positions with meticulous care. Engineers had tunneled into the rocky plateau, creating a network of caves and fortified bunkers that were nearly impervious to aerial bombardment and difficult to destroy with conventional artillery. Supply caches had been established throughout this subterranean labyrinth. Ammunition, rice, water, and medical supplies cached in locations that could sustain a prolonged defense. Gun emplacements were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that any American unit attempting to advance up the slopes would be subjected to crossfire from multiple directions simultaneously. Anti-tank guns were emplaced to prevent American armor from providing direct fire support to infantry assaulting the heights. Machine gun nests were sited along likely approach routes, their fields of observation extending across open ground where attackers would be exposed and vulnerable. Mortar positions were concealed in reverse slopes, allowing them to rain indirect fire on enemy concentrations without exposing themselves to direct counterfire. Every detail of the defense reflected months of preparation and the accumulated experience of a commander who understood that his survival depended on forcing the Americans to pay an unsustainable price for each meter of terrain gained. The American assault on the Fonte Plateau began in earnest during the 4th of August, and it proceeded with a grim predictability that would characterize much of the fighting to come. After days of preliminary reconnaissance, American commanders understood that a direct frontal assault up the plateau's slopes would be suicidal against an enemy possessing such commanding terrain and prepared defenses. Instead, they adopted a methodical approach that relied on the overwhelming firepower advantage they possessed and the patience to grind down the Japanese position through accumulation of small tactical victories. Artillery batteries positioned in the valleys below began an intensive bombardment that continued nearly without interruption, the guns firing thousands of rounds daily into suspected Japanese positions and known cave entrances. The pace of fire was so intense that ammunition supply became a critical concern, and trucks working around the clock struggled to move enough ordnance forward to sustain the bombardment. Naval gunfire from offshore ships added weight to the bombardment, cruisers and destroyers steering close enough to the coastline to direct accurate fire at the plateau from the south and east. Fighter bombers from escort carriers conducted repeated attacks on the plateau throughout daylight hours, dropping bombs and napalm on exposed positions and suspected command posts, adding another layer to the cascade of destruction raining down on the Japanese garrison. Yet artillery and aircraft alone could not capture terrain. Infantry had to assault, advance, and hold ground won through violence and sacrifice. American regiments approached the Fonte Plateau from multiple directions simultaneously, seeking to envelop the position and prevent Japanese reinforcement or escape. The fighting took on a character distinctly different from the earlier phases of the campaign. In the lower elevations and coastal areas, American forces had enjoyed overwhelming numerical superiority and firepower advantage that permitted relatively rapid advances despite determined Japanese resistance. Here, on the heights and in the rugged terrain surrounding the plateau, the Japanese had chosen ground that nullified some of those advantages and forced American units to engage in close-quarters combat, where the enemy's familiarity with terrain and preparation provided compensating advantage. Each day brought small gains measured in hundreds of meters, accompanied by lists of casualties that lengthened steadily as American soldiers pressed into the teeth of prepared defenses. Company-sized units would be committed to assault a particular bunker or cave entrance, supported by machine gun fire from nearby positions and artillery that would hammer the target until moments before the assault commenced. Soldiers would race across open ground, exposed and vulnerable, knowing that Japanese machine guns tracked every movement and that only speed and aggression offered any protection against the concentrated fire directed at them. The Americans learned harsh lessons about cave warfare and about the determination of defenders who understood that surrender meant death. Caves throughout the plateau served as both shelters and firing positions, their narrow entrances providing protected firing points while making them difficult targets for American weapons. Japanese defenders would allow American units to advance past a cave entrance, concentrating fire on the exposed soldiers. Then defenders would emerge from the cave or from concealed positions nearby to attack the Americans from unexpected directions. Flamethrower teams and demolition experts became crucial elements of the assault, advancing with infantry units to neutralize caves once they were located and contained. The psychological toll of this kind of fighting, never knowing where the next shot would come from, never certain whether an apparently cleared area truly had been cleared, wore on American soldiers with a relentlessness that matched the physical strain of climbing under fire into terrain designed for defense. Medical personnel worked constantly to treat the steady stream of wounded flowing back from the plateau, and evacuation became increasingly difficult as the number of casualties mounted and the terrain made transport nearly impossible. By the middle of August, American divisions pushing toward the plateau had suffered casualties equivalent to losing entire companies, with killed and wounded numbering in the hundreds daily. The Japanese garrison, meanwhile, endured their own grinding ordeal, though from a very different perspective. The constant bombardment destroyed supplies and killed soldiers through sheer concussive force and fragmentation. Compartmentalization of the cave system and frequent rotation of personnel in exposed positions limited casualties from individual strikes, but the cumulative effect of the bombardment was to slowly reduce the effective strength of the garrison. Water became a critical concern, as many cave systems lacked reliable water sources and supplies had to be brought from elsewhere during the nighttime hours when bombardment paused or diminished. Wounded men accumulated in the caves with minimal medical supplies, conditions deteriorating as infection and gangrene set in among soldiers who could not be evacuated to proper medical facilities. Communication between isolated units became increasingly difficult as bombardment cut telephone lines and radios were damaged or exhausted their power supplies. Takashina attempted to maintain command authority and coordinate the defense, but fragmentation was inevitable given the physical barriers created by the cave systems and the constant need to disperse troops to prevent concentrated bombardment from destroying entire units. Japanese soldiers understood they could not win the battle. The overwhelming American presence, the relentless supply convoys extending all the way back to the beachheads and beyond to distant island bases, the seemingly inexhaustible quantity of ammunition and aircraft and ships, all of these factors made the conclusion inevitable. What remained was only the manner of the ending and how much damage could be inflicted before the end arrived. American assault units pushed steadily upward and inward throughout the second week of August, compressing the Japanese perimeter and capturing the outer defensive positions that Takashina had prepared. As these positions fell, Japanese defenders withdrew to more heavily fortified inner strongpoints, extracting a price from the Americans for each position abandoned. The Fonte Plateau's central summit became the focus of increasingly intense assaults as American regiments maneuvered to attack from multiple directions, utilizing the terrain themselves to provide concealment and protection for their approach. Artillery bombardment before each assault increased in intensity, reaching crescendos in which thousands of rounds fell on the plateau within minutes, the ground shaking from the concussions, dust and smoke obscuring everything, the destruction so complete that surviving defenders sometimes wondered whether any Japanese soldier could possibly have survived such tempest. Yet they did survive. Enough remained to defend the final positions, to trigger artillery and mortar fire on assembling American units, to spray machine gun fire across open ground that the attackers had to cross to advance. Each day brought reports of gains and losses, of bunkers captured and caves destroyed, of casualties on both sides accumulating in incremental fashion as the battle wore into its second week on the plateau. American commanders understood that this phase of the campaign, though grinding and costly, was progressively destroying Japanese military capability on the island. Every defending soldier killed or wounded reduced the total strength available for the next defensive line, and while replacements did not arrive from Japan or elsewhere, the garrison could only decline in strength and fighting capacity. The American assault continued methodically, accepting casualties as the necessary cost of reducing a prepared position held by an enemy determined to fight to the death. Tank and self-propelled gun crews worked to position their vehicles to provide direct fire support to infantry assaults, but the terrain limited their maneuverability and made them vulnerable to Japanese anti-tank guns carefully concealed to cover likely routes of advance. Engineer platoons accompanied each assault, tasked with clearing obstacles, establishing routes through minefields, and preparing positions for defense once ground had been captured. The logistics of sustaining this intensity of combat grew more challenging as supply lines extended deeper into the interior and accumulating wounded filled available transport capacity. Doctors and medics worked in field hospitals and battalion aid stations throughout the advancing American positions, performing miracles of surgical skill and battlefield medicine, while acutely conscious of insufficient supplies and overwhelming demand for their services. By the 11th of August, American forces had captured the central summit of the Fonte Plateau and established defensive positions along the heights. The Japanese garrison, fragmented into isolated groups unable to communicate effectively with one another, had been compressed into shrinking enclaves throughout the plateau and surrounding terrain. Some Japanese soldiers retreated northward, seeking to continue the fight in the less developed northern regions of the island, while others refused to retreat and prepared for final stand positions that they knew would end in death. Takashina himself, directing the defense from a concealed command post deep within the plateau's cave system, remained committed to resistance even as the military situation became hopeless. The psychological distance between American commanders, increasingly confident in eventual total victory and focused on achieving it with acceptable casualties, and Japanese commanders, committed to dying in place rather than accepting surrender, created a fundamental incompatibility that guaranteed the continuation of fighting until one side or the other ceased to exist as an effective military force. The American assault on the Fonte Plateau represented the turning point of the Guam campaign, where the outcome ceased to be in doubt, where the war transitioned from a battle for control of the island to a methodical process of mopping up remaining resistance and securing complete dominance over the territory. The intensity of fighting around the plateau during this period set the pattern for the remainder of the campaign. Superior American firepower would be employed systematically to destroy Japanese defensive positions. American infantry would assault and capture the ground under bombardment, and Japanese defenders would either be killed in place or forced to retreat to the next prepared position, where the process would repeat. Casualties mounted on both sides as August progressed, but the asymmetry became increasingly pronounced. Japanese casualties, drawn from a fixed garrison with no replacements, reduced available defenders daily, while American casualties, though mounting into the thousands, could be sustained indefinitely by the American military machine. Wounded Americans were evacuated to medical facilities that grew more sophisticated as the campaign continued. American reinforcements arrived regularly to replace casualties and augment assault forces. American supplies flowed constantly from rear areas to sustain the fighting capacity of forward units. Japanese wounded accumulated in caves with minimal treatment. Japanese reinforcements never arrived. Japanese supplies, carefully rationed from the beginning of the occupation, were consumed in the intensive fighting and bombardment without prospect of resupply. The Fonte Plateau became the symbolic embodiment of the entire campaign, the last natural fortress where an isolated Japanese garrison attempted to resist the overwhelming tide of American military power. Knowing that resistance was ultimately futile, but choosing nevertheless to fight, because surrender was culturally impossible and death in combat remained preferable to the shame of capitulation. By the opening days of August, the character of the battle transformed fundamentally. The initial amphibious phase, with its dramatic beach landings and rapid consolidation of beachheads, had given way to something far more grinding and unforgiving. American forces now faced the grinding reality of mountain warfare in terrain that the Japanese had spent months preparing, and every kilometer gained toward the Fonte Plateau exacted a price measured in blood and exhaustion. The densely vegetated highlands of central Guam became a labyrinth where visibility rarely exceeded 50 meters, where every ravine concealed potential enemy positions, and where the advantage held by the defenders grew more pronounced with each step inland. The pace of advance, so rapid in those first days from Asan and Agana beaches, slowed dramatically as units encountered systematic resistance, carefully organized across multiple defensive layers. American commanders understood that speed alone could not break through positions so deliberately prepared, and the mathematical reality of their situation became ever clearer. They possessed superior numbers and firepower, but the Japanese held terrain purchased through weeks of labor and sacrifice. Supply lines that had seemed adequate in the first week began to fray under the strain of sustained operations across broken terrain, where every ton of ammunition, every gallon of fuel, every crate of rations had to be carried forward by human effort. The coral roads that engineers had hastily repaired from the initial landing zones could carry jeeps and lighter vehicles, but once units pushed beyond these rough highways into the jungle valleys and ridges where the fighting intensified, supplies moved on men's backs. Quartermaster trucks accumulated at collection points miles behind the fighting line, and from there the chain of supply became an endless procession of soldiers bent under loads of ammunition, water, and food, moving through heat and humidity that sapped strength with every step. Medical teams discovered that casualties could not be evacuated quickly enough, and field hospitals became overcrowded with wounded awaiting transport back to ships offshore or to hastily established surgical facilities near the beachheads. The distance between the front lines and these medical facilities grew daily, and the golden hours in which serious wounds could be treated with maximum effectiveness became compressed into a narrowing window. Doctors and corpsmen found themselves making impossible decisions about triage, and the psychological weight of these choices bore down on medical personnel as heavily as the physical exhaustion of combat bore on the riflemen. The terrain itself emerged as an enemy as implacable as the Japanese defenders. The highlands of Guam featured ridgelines that rose and fell in rapid succession, with slopes so steep that advancing soldiers had to use their hands as well as their feet to make progress, and every ascent left men breathless in the tropical heat. Ravines cut across the landscape without warning, and engineers struggled to establish supply routes that could accommodate even lightly loaded vehicles. The jungle vegetation grew so densely that units frequently lost visual contact with one another, making coordination between companies and battalions a constant challenge, requiring runners to move between positions. Rain fell almost daily, turning slopes into treacherous slides of mud, and soldiers discovered that the rot that attacked their feet within the first week of continuous moisture persisted relentlessly. Uniform fabric that never fully dried began to come apart, boots deteriorated, and the simple act of moving became increasingly difficult as soldiers' bodies accumulated the cumulative effects of inadequate rest and nutrition in an environment hostile to human health. The psychological impact of fighting in such terrain extended beyond the immediate tactical challenge, creating a sense of claustrophobia and disorientation that affected morale and judgment in ways that open-ground combat did not. Japanese commanders had deliberately chosen this terrain as their stronghold, understanding perfectly that the elevation and vegetation that made movement so difficult for attackers simultaneously negated much of the American advantage in air support and artillery. They had positioned their strongest units around Mount Lamlam and across the Fonte Plateau, the highest terrain on the island, from which they could observe approach routes and direct fire down onto advancing Americans with devastating effect. The layered nature of their defenses meant that American units could not simply blast through one line of resistance and then advance freely. Instead, each forward movement brought attackers into range of Japanese positions previously unobserved, and the tempo of combat became a deadly rhythm of assault, followed by regrouping, reconnaissance, followed by another assault against defenses that seemed to regenerate with each American attempt to penetrate them. Japanese soldiers, many of them survivors of the preliminary bombardment and the initial landings, had learned through bitter experience that their position was ultimately untenable. Yet this knowledge seemed to harden rather than weaken their determination to exact maximum cost for every meter the Americans advanced. The human cost of this grinding campaign accumulated day by day throughout early and mid-August. American units that had landed with full strength on the 21st of July found themselves, by the first week of August, reduced to perhaps 50 or 60% of their authorized strength through death, wounds, and the mounting cases of heat exhaustion and tropical disease. Reinforcements arrived regularly from transport ships anchored offshore, but newly landed troops often went into combat before they could fully acclimate to the heat and the psychological pressure of the densely forested combat zone. Veterans and replacements alike discovered that casualties seemed to follow no predictable pattern. A patrol moving along what seemed like a safe route suddenly took fire from hidden positions, or a unit preparing to attack a known Japanese strongpoint found itself attacked first from an unexpected direction. The intensity and unpredictability of combat created a state of constant alertness that the human body could not sustain indefinitely, and commanders observed a subtle but undeniable erosion in unit effectiveness as fatigue accumulated. Supply sergeants reported that ammunition consumption continued to exceed estimates, and artillery batteries firing in support of forward units expended ordnance at a rate that stretched supply lines to their limit. The relentless demand for firepower meant that support troops working in rear areas faced constant pressure to maintain the flow of ammunition forward, and the noise of continuous artillery fire created a psychological backdrop of urgency that never relented. Japanese soldiers in their fortified positions faced a different but equally devastating form of attrition. The American artillery bombardment that preceded each infantry assault killed defenders trapped in their bunkers or caught in the open, and the sheer volume of ordnance falling on the Fonte Plateau created casualties that Japanese medical facilities, themselves damaged by preliminary bombardment, could not adequately treat. Japanese infantry, lacking the American advantage in medical evacuation and antibiotics, died from wounds that American soldiers might have survived. Supply shortages that had begun during the preliminary naval bombardment became critical by early August, as American naval forces controlled the waters around Guam and prevented reinforcement or resupply by sea. Japanese rations diminished as food stocks consumed in the first days of the campaign were not replaced, and hunger added to the physical and psychological strain of sustained combat. Communications between dispersed Japanese units became increasingly difficult, and commanders in some sectors lost reliable contact with their superiors, making coordinated defense progressively less feasible. Yet despite this deteriorating situation, Japanese soldiers continued to resist with determination that American soldiers, however well supplied and well supported, found themselves unable to break through will alone. The nature of combat in the highlands created scenarios that haunted soldiers long after the fighting ended. Small unit leaders learned through repeated experience that frontal assault against prepared positions cost lives without guarantee of success. Yet orders from higher command emphasized offensive momentum, and the tension between tactical prudence and strategic necessity created constant moral complexity. Soldiers advancing through the jungle encountered Japanese soldiers who emerged suddenly from caves or spider holes, leading to close-quarters combat in which there was no possibility of surrender on either side. Americans discovered that some Japanese soldiers, facing certain death, chose to detonate grenades rather than be captured, and this knowledge created a reciprocal brutality in which both sides recognized that the normal conventions of warfare held no meaning in this particular terrain. Medics recorded observations of soldiers on the verge of psychological breakdown, men who had endured weeks of combat without rest, and who found their capacity for continued violence and resistance to fear approaching absolute limit. Chaplains moving with the forward units heard confessions and offered absolution for acts that soldiers found themselves committing but struggled to reconcile with their understanding of their own character. The logistics of supporting this expanded offensive reached critical strain by the second week of August. Quartermaster officers ashore realized that the supplies they had calculated as sufficient for operations lasting perhaps 2 weeks were being consumed at a rate that suggested a campaign potentially lasting several weeks more. Requests for additional ammunition, medical supplies, and food went up the chain of command, where admirals controlling shipping resources faced competing demands from the ongoing campaign in the Central Pacific and from preparations for the next phase of operations against the Philippines. Every additional ton of supplies shipped to Guam meant that ton could not be sent to other operations, and commanders in various theaters pressed their cases with increasing urgency. The solution involved improvisation and efficiency, shortening meal rations slightly, requesting that artillery units reduce the intensity of bombardments in marginal sectors to conserve ammunition, and carefully husbanding fuel to ensure that forward positions could be supplied while maintaining reserves for emergencies. Hospital ships anchored offshore reached their capacity for wounded, forcing medical personnel to discharge some soldiers back to field units despite incomplete recovery, a decision that officers and doctors found distasteful yet necessary given the realities of military medicine in a constrained situation. By mid-August, the Japanese defensive line was collapsing, though this strategic reality did not immediately translate into cessation of combat. American units had pushed forward with painful consistency, and the Fonte Plateau, which Japanese defenders had held as the ultimate stronghold, began to show signs of cracking under the systematic pressure. Yet Japanese soldiers occupying caves and fortified positions in the northern reaches of the island, understanding that the main defensive line could not hold, began preparing themselves for what many believed would be a prolonged guerrilla campaign. They redistributed supplies to smaller caches in remote locations, established fallback positions in terrain even more difficult and inaccessible than the highlands they currently occupied, and organized themselves for what they believed would be a long and costly battle of attrition. American intelligence officers, analyzing prisoner interrogations and captured documents, understood that the defeat of organized Japanese defense did not necessarily mean the end of fighting, and commanders began planning for the subsequent phase of operations in which scattered enemy soldiers would have to be located and eliminated across terrain where they held all the advantages of knowledge and concealment. The cumulative effect of sustained combat throughout the first half of August manifested across every element of the American force. infantry companies reported moral and physical fatigue that extended beyond what soldiers could overcome through leadership and discipline alone. Supply personnel pushing tonnage forward along precarious routes found themselves working without adequate rest, and maintenance crews servicing vehicles and equipment discovered that parts and replacements were becoming scarce as the campaign consumed resources at an accelerating rate. Commanders at every level faced decisions about how long to press forward before withdrawing units for rest and reconstitution, balancing the military advantage of maintaining momentum against the necessity of preserving force effectiveness. The weather, which had been intense but tolerable in late July, began to show patterns suggesting that typhoon season in the Western Pacific might soon impact operations, and this additional consideration pressed commanders to accelerate their offensive timeline. By the middle of August, American forces had inflicted enough casualties and captured enough terrain that the military situation for Japanese defenders was mathematically hopeless. Yet the translation of military hopelessness into actual surrender and cessation of fighting would prove far more complex and costly than simple logic suggested. The grinding reality of Highlands warfare revealed itself through statistics that only partially captured the human reality behind the numbers. American divisions reported casualty rates that, while not catastrophic by the standards of some Pacific campaigns, represented continuous and steady attrition that degraded unit effectiveness and required constant reinforcement with replacement soldiers. Japanese forces, lacking medical care and operating at the extreme end of supply shortages, suffered proportionally higher casualty rates among their remaining strength. Yet their determination to resist showed no sign of wavering. The medical services on both sides operated at the limits of their capacity, and medical personnel later recalled the experience as a test of professional skill and emotional resilience that few had anticipated. The noise of sustained combat created an acoustic environment in which soldiers' hearing suffered cumulative damage, a fact that would become apparent only years after the campaign ended. The constant vigilance required in an environment where enemy positions could appear from any direction without warning created a psychological strain that manifested in subtle ways. Difficulty sleeping despite exhaustion, reduced appetite despite hunger, and an emotional numbness that preserved function at the cost of long-term psychological health. The Mountain War of August 1944 on Guam represented the brutal middle phase of the campaign, when initial American success had given way to systematic struggle against an enemy fighting from prepared terrain with nothing left to lose. The terrain itself had become a participant in the combat, amplifying the advantages held by defenders while constraining the logistical advantages held by attackers. American soldiers, fighting in conditions that tested every aspect of their physical and psychological resilience, maintained their advance through sheer determination and the steady application of superior firepower. Japanese soldiers, defending terrain they had spent weeks preparing, inflicted casualties that ensured the victory would carry permanent costs for those who survived it. The intensity of combat in these weeks created bonds between soldiers that would persist for the rest of their lives and generated memories that would return unbidden in peaceful moments decades after the war ended. By the time organized Japanese resistance began to collapse in late August, the true cost of retaking Guam had become apparent to every soldier and officer who had fought in the Highlands, and the subsequent mopping-up operations, though presented as an aftermath, would themselves consume resources and lives in quantities that belied the characterization as secondary fighting. In the dense jungle south of Agana, where the American advance had begun to splinter into smaller, more desperate engagements, The command structure of the Japanese garrison was crumbling under the weight of relentless American pressure. General Takeshi Takashina, the 58-year-old commander of all Japanese forces on Guam, had spent the preceding weeks moving between defensive positions, attempting to coordinate resistance from a collapsing network of command posts and field shelters scattered across the island's interior. He was a professional soldier of the old school, trained in the rigid hierarchies of the Imperial Japanese Army, and he understood with absolute clarity that his position was militarily hopeless. Yet understanding hopelessness and accepting it were two entirely different things, and Takashina had committed himself to extracting as high a price as possible from the American invaders, even knowing the final outcome was predetermined. He had established his main headquarters near the Fonte Plateau, at the heart of what remained of organized Japanese resistance, and from there he directed the tactical responses that, while ultimately futile, nonetheless inflicted steady casualties on advancing American units throughout the final week of July. The general's operational situation had deteriorated with stunning rapidity following the initial landings on the 21st of July. Within 48 hours, American forces had consolidated their beachheads and begun pushing inland with such weight and momentum that Takashina found himself unable to execute even the tactical counteroffensives he had meticulously planned during the 2 years of Japanese occupation. His air support had evaporated entirely, destroyed by American naval aviation in the weeks preceding the invasion. His supply lines, never robust, had been systematically severed by American naval blockade and air interdiction, leaving his remaining 17,000 troops increasingly dependent on captured American stores and local provisions. Communications between his scattered units had become intermittent at best, rendered unreliable by American electronic warfare and the practical difficulty of maintaining radio contact across terrain made chaotic by artillery and air bombardment. Takashina himself had moved multiple times, always staying ahead of the American advance, and each displacement had isolated him further from the troops he nominally commanded. Yet he continued to send out orders, to attempt coordination of defensive efforts, and to maintain the fiction of command authority even as the actual control of Japanese forces fragmented into increasingly independent actions by units responding to local conditions rather than overall strategy. By the 29th of July, Takashina had relocated again, moving closer to the front lines in an effort to personally observe the state of American penetration and determine where defensive resources might yet be concentrated. He traveled with a small staff and a modest security detail, moving through terrain that was already becoming perilous for any Japanese officer caught in the open as American air and artillery dominance made daylight movement increasingly suicidal. The general was determined to see the situation firsthand, rather than relying on reports that he knew, by that point in the campaign, were often wildly inaccurate or days out of date. His personal bravery was never in question, even by American accounts after the war, and he seemed to embody a particular strain of Japanese military culture that viewed commanders as having an obligation to share the dangers faced by their troops, to lead from forward positions, and ultimately to accept personal risk as inseparable from command responsibility. The precise circumstances of Takashina's death remain somewhat unclear, obscured by the fog of combat and the lack of surviving Japanese documentation detailing his final movements. What is known is that he was encountered by American forces on the 29th of July, 9 days after the invasion had begun, and that combat ensued resulting in his death. Some accounts suggest he was hit by artillery fire while attempting to move between positions. Others indicate he was killed in a direct engagement with American infantry or Marines who encountered his group unexpectedly in the jungle. The lack of definitive detail is not unusual in the context of Pacific War combat, where so many deaths occurred in brief, brutal encounters in terrain that made later investigation and corroboration nearly impossible. What mattered far more than the precise manner of his death was the political and psychological significance of that death, announced and confirmed through Japanese command channels and rapidly disseminated among the remaining garrison. Word of Takashina's death spread through the scattered remnants of organized Japanese resistance like a shockwave, arriving at forward positions and isolated command posts through what radio communications still functioned, through runners moving between units, and through the simple fact that rumors of such magnitude travel faster than any official communication in the chaos of a deteriorating military situation. For the Japanese soldiers still fighting, still believing they might somehow trade enough American lives for survival, the death of their commander represented the final severing of the thread connecting them to some larger strategic purpose. Takashina had been the symbol of Japanese resistance on Guam, the embodiment of the command structure that organized and directed their combat actions. Without him, individual soldiers and small unit leaders found themselves operating in an even more profound isolation, knowing that even the pretense of coordinated defense had essentially ceased. The psychological weight of his death cannot be overstated in the context of Japanese military culture, where subordinates derived much of their sense of purpose and meaning from their relationship to command authority. With that authority literally dead, the moral foundation of continued organized resistance began to collapse almost immediately. The Japanese army made efforts to maintain continuity of command, and control of Japanese forces on Guam passed to other senior officers who continued to direct resistance and to attempt some degree of tactical coordination of remaining units. Yet these successor commanders lacked Takashina's seniority, prestige, and the accumulated authority that comes from having commanded forces in actual combat for the preceding 9 days of the invasion. The American forces, meanwhile, capitalized immediately on the vacuum created by Takashina's death, intensifying pressure across the island and allowing their forces no respite to reorganize or settle into prepared positions. The Japanese defensive line, which had been a coherent, if increasingly strained network of positions, began to fracture into isolated pockets of resistance that, while sometimes fierce, were no longer coordinated as part of an overall strategy. Units that might have withdrawn to secondary positions under orders from a functioning command structure instead became trapped, forced to fight where they stood with diminishing supplies and no clear sense of what they were fighting for beyond simple survival and the cultural imperative never to surrender. The death of Takashina also removed one of the few Japanese commanders on Guam with the authority and strategic understanding to potentially have negotiated some form of conditional surrender or evacuation that might have preserved at least some portion of the garrison. The general, professional, and realistic had understood by late July that organized defense could no longer be sustained, and that the best that Japanese forces could achieve was to impose maximum American casualties while maintaining unit cohesion as long as possible. With his death, that final thread of possibility for organized withdrawal vanished, replaced by a more desperate calculus in which individual unit commanders found themselves forced to make tactical decisions with fragmentary information and without clear guidance from higher authority. Some units did manage to maintain some degree of organization and conducted retreats northward into the rugged terrain of the island's interior, where they would continue to conduct intermittent resistance for weeks and months. Others fragmented immediately, scattering into caves and fortified positions with no clear objective beyond simple survival. American commanders, for their part, recognized the significance of Takashina's death, not merely as a tactical event, but as a turning point in the psychological and operational collapse of Japanese resistance on the island. Intelligence officers confirmed his identity and reported the kill through command channels, and the information quickly cascaded through American unit structures as confirmation that Japanese organized defense was in fact disintegrating. The death of an enemy commander of such seniority was a rare occurrence in the Pacific War, where Japanese officers and men typically fought to the death in place rather than being killed while moving or coordinating operations. That Takashina had died while apparently attempting to move between positions suggested to American commanders that the Japanese situation was now so dire that even senior leadership could not maintain safe positions in rear areas. It was a sign of system collapse, of command and control becoming impossible to maintain, and of the approaching moment when organized Japanese resistance would cease and the campaign would transition to the uglier, more grinding phase of hunting scattered soldiers through jungle and caves. The weeks immediately following Takashina's death bore out every American expectation about the deterioration of Japanese resistance. Without coordinated command authority, Japanese units that had been conducting organized defensive operations began to dissolve into smaller groups, each responding to immediate local circumstances and the decisions of whatever officers or senior non-commissioned officers remained alive and functioning. Some soldiers and small units continued to fight with remarkable ferocity, surrendering not at all and dying in place when American forces finally overwhelmed them. Others, facing the reality that Takashina's death symbolized the complete failure of whatever grand strategic vision had animated Japanese resistance, began to consider the possibility of surrender, though Japanese military culture made even this act of survival morally fraught and accompanied by shame. The period from late July through early August, the weeks immediately following Takashina's death, thus became a critical inflection point in the campaign, marking the transition from conventional battle with defined front lines and coherent strategic objectives to the grinding, attritional phase of eliminating dispersed and increasingly demoralized enemy forces. For the American forces pushing deeper into the island's interior, the death of Takashina meant that their advance would likely encounter less organized opposition and fewer coordinated counterattacks. But it also meant that the remaining combat would become more dangerous in different ways. Japanese soldiers without command authority, knowing their position was hopeless, sometimes fought with even greater desperation than they had during the earlier, more organized phases of the campaign. The loss of command authority also removed any possibility of orderly retreat or consolidation of forces, meaning that Americans would now have to hunt down scattered soldiers individually or in small groups, a process that was time-consuming, resource-intensive, and often more costly in casualties per enemy killed than conventional pitched battle. The grinding phase of the campaign, the third and most exhausting phase of the 3-week battle, was only just beginning when Takashina fell, yet his death marked the moment when everyone involved in the fighting understood that the final outcome was no longer in doubt. It was a threshold moment, a point of no return from which organized Japanese resistance would only continue to disintegrate, and from which American forces would gradually solidify their control over an island that would serve as a staging area for the final assault against Japan itself. Takashina's death also symbolized something larger about the transformation of American power and Japanese capacity in the Pacific theater by the summer of 1944. The Japanese officer corps included many men of considerable professional competence and personal bravery, men who understood modern warfare and possessed the tactical intelligence to execute complex defensive operations. Yet no amount of individual courage or professional skill could overcome the overwhelming disadvantages that Japan faced by mid-1944. Disadvantages rooted in industrial capacity, manpower reserves, technological sophistication, and the sheer logistical ability to project military force across oceanic distances. Takashina had done what he could with what he had been given, had organized the defense of Guam competently, and had attempted to extract maximum cost from the American invasion. Yet his death, unremarkable in the broader context of a campaign that would claim tens of thousands of lives over 3 weeks, nonetheless served as a punctuation mark on Japanese aspirations to hold any portion of the Central Pacific against American assault. The general had gambled that defense of Guam would bleed the American advance and slow the momentum that was carrying American forces relentlessly westward toward the Philippines and toward Japan itself. Instead, his death marked the moment when that advance became unstoppable, when even the symbols of Japanese command authority could no longer impede the American determination to reclaim lost territory and to continue the methodical dismantling of Japanese power across the Pacific. By the first week of August, the organized structure that General Takashina had painstakingly built across the central highlands of Guam had begun to unravel. American firepower, relentless and methodical, was systematically dismantling the defensive network the Japanese had spent months constructing. Artillery barrages that thundered across the Fonte Plateau and the heights surrounding Mount Lamlam did more than destroy bunkers and fortifications. They shattered the cohesion of Japanese units, killed experienced officers and non-commissioned officers who could no longer be replaced, and forced survivors into smaller, isolated pockets scattered across the northern interior of the island. What had been a unified defensive line under central command fragmented into autonomous groups, often no larger than platoons or companies, bereft of communication with higher headquarters and increasingly uncertain about what they were supposed to accomplish. The numerical advantage American forces possessed was becoming impossible to deny. More than 50,000 American troops had landed on Guam, and their numbers continued to grow as fresh units arrived daily to reinforce the beachheads and supply bases. Against them, General Takashina's command had melted from an initial 17,000 defenders to fewer than 10,000 effective combatants by the end of July. The Japanese soldiers still capable of fighting knew these numbers. They had witnessed what American artillery could do, had seen airstrikes reduce entire hillsides to rubble, had fought against enemies who seemed to have ammunition in limitless supply, and who could call down naval gunfire support with a radio transmission. The myth of Japanese military invincibility, which had sustained morale during the first days of fighting, had evaporated like morning mist under the heat of American cannon fire and coordinated assault tactics that gave defenders nowhere to hide and no respite from pressure. The death of General Takashina on the 29th of July, barely a week into the campaign, accelerated the psychological and organizational collapse already taking hold. Officers who had looked to his leadership and his strategic vision now faced a command vacuum that was never adequately filled. Communications between fragmented Japanese units deteriorated rapidly as telephone lines were severed by artillery, radio operators were killed or their equipment destroyed, and survivors found themselves isolated from one another across miles of difficult terrain. Orders from what remained of headquarters became sporadic and increasingly irrelevant to the immediate survival concerns of soldiers dug into caves and fortified positions under constant assault. Junior officers and senior enlisted men were forced to make tactical decisions with incomplete information and no possibility of coordinating their actions with neighboring units. The result was not adaptation or innovative resistance. It was paralysis masked by desperation. Some commanders attempted to maintain defensive integrity in their assigned sectors, pulling back gradually through prepared fallback positions and attempting to inflict casualties on advancing Americans. Others, recognizing that their positions were being systematically targeted and that artillery made any organized defense suicidal, began ordering their troops to disperse into the jungle interior and prepare for extended guerrilla operations. This was not a coherent strategic decision made at higher levels. It was a series of independent decisions made by isolated leaders who saw organized resistance becoming meaningless and believed that dispersal into the island's interior, where terrain might offset American firepower, offered the only chance for survival. The Japanese soldiers themselves, exhausted after more than a week of continuous combat and bombardment, faced a choice that was no choice at all. Surrender meant certain death. This belief, drilled into every soldier through years of military training and propaganda, was reinforced by propaganda that depicted Americans as savage enemies who would torture and execute anyone who laid down their weapons. Some of this fear had foundation in isolated incidents and stories passed between units. Much of it was psychological conditioning, fear of dishonor, and the shame of capitulation to an enemy. Japanese military culture, with its emphasis on dying for the emperor rather than accepting defeat, created a closed loop of fatalism. Soldiers could not surrender without losing all honor. They could not fight on in organized formations without being slaughtered by artillery. So they dispersed. They broke into smaller groups and moved into terrain where American artillery could not effectively reach them, where dense jungle might provide concealment, where caves and fortified positions offered at least temporary shelter. Some groups numbered only a dozen men or fewer, led by junior officers or experienced non-commissioned officers whose rank gave them authority but not the information or resources to conduct anything resembling military operations. These men were no longer soldiers in any conventional sense. They were isolated survivors attempting to maintain cohesion and purpose in circumstances designed to strip both away. The fragmentation accelerated dramatically as American forces shifted their tactics to apply pressure across the entire island rather than concentrating solely on the main defensive lines. Mobile American units began ranging far beyond the immediate front lines, seeking out Japanese positions in the northern highlands and applying swift, overwhelming firepower to any group they encountered. Japanese soldiers who had spent weeks or months preparing fortified positions discovered that abandonment often meant survival, while remaining in place meant annihilation. The calculated risk assessment that had favored defensive stands when forces were numerous and coordinated no longer applied. Individual commanders began ordering withdrawal, and units that had been neighbors on the defensive line suddenly found themselves separated from one another, each group retreating along its own path into the mountainous interior. Supply dumps that had been carefully stockpiled were overrun or evacuated. Medical facilities were abandoned or destroyed. Communication became increasingly difficult as the Japanese tried to maintain contact across fragmented territory without functioning radio networks or telephone infrastructure. What had been the 36th Division and the 35th Independent Artillery Regiment transformed into a collection of isolated detachments operating independently, each uncertain of the larger situation and most convinced that their primary duty now was survival rather than victory. The American forces pursuing these fragmenting units adapted quickly to changed circumstances. Infantry platoons and company-sized elements learned to move through the jungle cautiously, using supporting fire from machine guns and mortars, and avoiding the kind of mass assaults that invited ambush or suicidal counterattack. Tank crews discovered that the relatively close terrain in northern Guam limited their mobility, but gave them immense advantages when they could be brought to bear on enemy positions. Artillery continued to play a devastating role, with forward observers calling down fire on any reported Japanese location, turning the jungle into a deadly landscape where concealment was temporary and shelter beneath tree canopy offered minimal protection against exploding shells and shrapnel. American soldiers, many of them veteran of earlier Pacific campaigns, had learned that Japanese soldiers fighting in small groups were actually more dangerous than organized units in some respects, more likely to fight to the death, more prone to sudden counterattacks or banzai charges in the darkness, more willing to accept atrocities against prisoners or wounded men. Vigilance remained constant even as Japanese organized resistance collapsed, and American casualty rates remained significant even as the tactical situation shifted decisively in American favor. For the scattered Japanese soldiers retreating into the northern interior, the experience was one of progressive disorientation and dissolution of military order. Officers attempted to maintain unit cohesion and discipline, but without communication with other units or higher headquarters, without reliable supplies or medical support, and under constant pressure from pursuing Americans, their authority became increasingly tenuous. Soldiers who had accepted that they would die in defense of prepared positions now had to accept a different kind of death, hunted, exhausted, pursued through terrain that offered little sustenance and no safety. Food was scarce, with supply lines cut and no opportunity to cultivate or forage without exposing themselves to American patrols. Water came from streams and springs that were often covered by American fire or lay in areas where Americans expected Japanese to congregate. Wounded men who could not keep pace with retreating groups had to be left behind or killed to prevent them from falling into American hands and potentially revealing unit locations or strength through interrogation. The physical and psychological toll of this experience transformed fighting men into survivors focused on immediate needs, avoiding death today, finding shelter tonight, locating food tomorrow. The larger war, the war for the Philippines and for control of the Pacific, became abstractions that mattered less, with each passing day of desperate retreat through unforgiving terrain. The nature of Japanese resistance during this phase of the campaign shifted fundamentally from structured defense to what military historians would later term guerrilla warfare, though calling it that granted the scattered units more organization and strategic purpose than they actually possessed. These were not coordinated insurgent forces operating according to a coherent plan and communicating with one another across the island. They were isolated groups of survivors attempting to maintain existence in conditions of severe deprivation and constant threat. Some groups established temporary camps in caves or fortified positions in the northern highlands, attempting to wait out the American campaign and preserve their numbers for a hypothetical future phase of combat that most soldiers knew would never come. Other groups remained mobile, moving through the jungle at night, attempting to reach areas of the island where American forces had not yet penetrated, hoping that the vast interior would somehow provide sanctuary. Neither approach was sustainable. American forces continued to expand their control outward from the beachheads and supply bases, and there was no meaningful sanctuary on an island that was roughly 40 kilometers long and 20 kilometers wide. The Japanese soldiers knew this intellectually, yet they moved anyway, driven by necessity and by the impossibility of accepting surrender as an alternative. American commanders, recognizing that organized resistance had collapsed, but aware that significant Japanese forces remained at large across the island, shifted their strategic focus towards securing key terrain and establishing control over population centers rather than pursuing a desperate hunt for every remaining Japanese soldier in the jungle. This proved to be a logical calculation. The practical end state for military purposes was the capture of the island and the establishment of American control over its key features. Significant Japanese forces remained scattered and dangerous, but they posed no immediate threat to American consolidation of control and could be dealt with through subsequent mopping-up operations that would take weeks or months, but did not require the intensity of effort demanded during the main campaign. By early August, American forces had seized the high ground, controlled the roads, occupied the main population centers, and established defensive positions against any organized Japanese counterattack, none of which materialized. The remaining Japanese forces were too fragmented, too dispersed, and too depleted to mount any coordinated response to American domination of the island. They could still kill American soldiers in ambushes or desperate firefights, but they could not contest American control of any significant terrain, and that distinction mattered enormously for military purposes. The psychological impact of this fragmentation on the remaining Japanese soldiers cannot be overstated. Men who had trained for months or years in preparation for a defensive stand that would prove their courage and commitment to the emperor suddenly found themselves relegated to fugitive status, hiding from enemies they could not effectively fight, focused entirely on personal survival rather than unit mission or national purpose. The entire ideological framework that had sustained them, honor through sacrifice, victory through courage and determination, death before dishonor, was rendered meaningless by circumstances beyond their control. Japanese soldiers had been told that American firepower could be overcome through will and courage, that American soldiers were soft and lacked the martial spirit of Japanese warriors, that the island's terrain and carefully prepared defenses would make Guam impregnable. Each of these statements had been contradicted by the grinding reality of American assault tactics, technological superiority, and overwhelming firepower. The ideological collapse was as significant as the military collapse, creating a profound sense of betrayal and futility among men who had accepted death as preferable to surrender, yet found themselves unable to achieve even that honorable death they had been promised. Some soldiers broke psychologically during this phase, becoming unable to function or follow orders. Others channeled their desperation into determined resistance, committing to individual or small group actions that they knew were futile, but that allowed them to maintain a sense of agency and purpose in circumstances designed to strip both away. By the second week of August, American forces had effectively declared Guam secured, even though Japanese soldiers remained at large across the island's interior. The declaration was militarily accurate, in the sense that American forces controlled the territory, the population, and the strategic objective. It was not accurate in the sense that combat operations had ended or that all Japanese resistance had ceased. Officers and enlisted men who had fought on the front lines during the first 2 weeks of July now found themselves assigned to patrols into the northern interior, search and destroy missions to hunt down remaining Japanese soldiers, and security operations around American installations and supply bases. These operations would continue for weeks, revealing the slow dissolution of the scattered Japanese units into groups so small and so depleted that they posed little threat but required significant American effort to locate and neutralize. The intensity of combat had diminished markedly, but the danger persisted, and American casualties continued to accumulate at a slower but still meaningful rate as soldiers died to sniper fire, booby traps, or sudden attacks by cornered and desperate men who had nothing left to lose. The collapse of organized Japanese defense marked a critical transition in the campaign. The war for Guam's main terrain features, for control of the island's key positions, and for the ability to establish an American military presence on Guamanian soil had been won. What remained was the unglamorous work of pursuing scattered survivors, consolidating American control, and preparing the island for its transformation into a major staging area for operations against the Philippines and the subsequent assault on the Japanese homeland itself. The American victory was complete in the sense that mattered most. The island was in American hands. The military objective had been achieved, and the Japanese defense structure had been broken beyond any possibility of regeneration. Yet victory came with costs that were not insignificant. Casualties continued to accumulate among American forces assigned to security operations and patrol duties across the island. Japanese soldiers, refusing surrender and determined to resist until death or escape became possible, would continue fighting in small groups and individual actions long after organized resistance had ended. The war on Guam had entered a new phase, one that was less visible to distant observers and less dramatic than the initial assault and the battles for the main defensive lines, but no less real for the men involved in it. The fragmentation of Japanese forces across Guam during early August represented the end of any possibility that the island might be retained under Japanese control, and the beginning of a prolonged and costly process of American consolidation and security operations that would occupy military resources for weeks and months beyond the declared end of organized resistance. The human cost of this fragmentation fell on both sides. American soldiers who would be wounded or killed pursuing scattered defenders into dangerous terrain, and Japanese soldiers who faced death through combat, starvation, disease, or capture and interrogation rather than the possibility of survival or negotiated surrender. The island of Guam, which had been transformed from a quiet colonial outpost into a theater of total war, would soon transform again, becoming a crucial American military facility and a symbol of American power in the Western Pacific. But first, there remained the work of consolidating victory, eliminating remaining resistance, and rebuilding the island and its devastated Chamorro population under American military administration. The 10th of August, 1944, official reports declared Guam secured. Flag ceremonies were held. Communiques were issued to waiting newsrooms across America. Yet deep in the island's northern wilderness, amid limestone caves and tangled jungle so dense that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, hundreds of Japanese soldiers remained alive, armed, and dangerous. For the American forces who believed the fighting had ended, the real struggle was only beginning. The battle for Guam had been won in the conventional sense. Terrain conquered, strategic positions captured, organized enemy formations broken and dispersed. But the island itself had become a labyrinth, where victory meant something far different and far more exhausting than controlling ground on a map. The Japanese soldiers still loose in the highlands had made a conscious choice. Surrender, in their military culture and training, was unthinkable, a concept that meant disgrace, dishonor, and often execution by their own officers if the opportunity arose. When organized resistance collapsed and General Takashina's defensive lines shattered under relentless American pressure, these men did not lay down their weapons and emerge from their fortifications with hands raised. Instead, they dispersed into the wilderness, carrying what supplies they could salvage, seeking refuge in the cave systems that honeycomb the northern plateau. Some officers attempted to maintain unit cohesion and coordinate further resistance. Others simply vanished into the jungle as individuals, small groups, or squads, determined to resist as long as life remained in their bodies. American intelligence estimates suggested between 2,000 and 3,000 enemy soldiers were still unaccounted for when official victory was declared. The actual number was closer to 2,000, but that distinction mattered little to the soldiers tasked with finding them. For American commanders, the situation presented an urgent tactical problem. Every Japanese soldier left alive represented a potential threat to rear area installations, supply lines, and the thousands of American servicemen now occupying the island to prepare it as a staging area for future operations. The island was needed as a base, immediately and fully. Runways had to be expanded, supply depots had to be established, headquarters, hospitals, barracks, and ammunition storage facilities had to be constructed. But none of this could proceed safely while armed enemy troops roamed the interior. Units that should have been rotating back to rest areas or reassigning to new objectives had to remain on Guam, tasked with the thankless job of hunting through impenetrable terrain for an enemy that had every reason to stay hidden and every incentive to fight when cornered. The search operations that began in the second week of August took on a character entirely different from conventional warfare. There were no clear front lines, no defined enemy positions to assault, no opportunity to mass firepower against concentrated forces. Instead, American platoons and companies, sometimes just small reconnaissance patrols, had to push into country where visibility might measure only a few meters. The jungle vegetation on Guam grew so thickly in many areas that soldiers could walk within arm's length of a Japanese soldier and never see him until a grenade exploded or a rifle cracked through the undergrowth. The caves presented even greater danger. Many had multiple entrances and exits carved through limestone over centuries, creating underground passages that could extend hundreds of meters into the hillside. Japanese soldiers in these caves had spent weeks or months improving their fortifications, carving firing positions, establishing water sources, and stockpiling food and ammunition. When Americans approached, defenders could rain fire down from concealed positions, retreat deeper into the cave system, or lie in absolute silence until attackers were nearly on top of them. The techniques American forces developed for clearing caves and jungle strongpoints were born from bitter trial and error. Engineers learned to carry explosives specifically designed for cave warfare, satchel charges and Bangalore torpedoes that could be inserted into cave entrances from a distance, reducing the need for men to advance directly into the mouths of fortifications. Flamethrower teams, equipped with heavy tanks of pressurized fuel and ignition systems, were brought forward to burn out caves and kill defenders through sheer incineration. Demolition specialists rigged charges at cave entrances to collapse them entirely, trapping enemy soldiers and eliminating the threat permanently. Yet for all this ingenuity and firepower, caves were still places where combat was intensely personal, often hand-to-hand, with American soldiers knowing that any corner might conceal a Japanese soldier willing to die rather than surrender. Losses mounted steadily, not the catastrophic casualties of the main battle, but steady bleeding of American lives, to injuries and deaths that served no strategic purpose except to deny the Japanese the ability to continue resistance that was already militarily futile. The psychological toll of mop-up operations was profound and often underestimated by historians. Soldiers who had endured